Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being prompt and back in your seats. I will tell you that I want to begin by saluting the courage of the panelists. I once put on a conference and I called up one of my dearest friends and I asked her to make a presentation, and she said, well, what time is it? And I said, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon after people come back from lunch. And she said, not even for you would I do such a thing. So we're going to keep everybody awake. It's very brave of them to volunteer for this time slot. And we really do have a wonderful panel today. And I will introduce each of them as they begin their presentations. What I see as my role is to both keep us on track, but really the framing that I'd like to put around this and what I'd like us to try to keep in mind is looking for harmonization of approaches. How can we begin to get closer to a parsimonious set of indicators that we follow in common and that makes sense to us, and where we have a shared set of methodologies that are widely understood of ways of getting at project and program evaluation. So our first speaker will be Rachel Jackson. She is the Strategic Information and Research Specialist at the International Justice Mission and a member of the Monitoring and Evaluation of Trafficking in Persons group. In her role at IJM, Rachel designs and manages research studies and helps build the organization's capacity for effective monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. And with that, by way of introduction, Rachel, let me turn this over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much. I just want to start by thanking the organizers of the event. It has been excellent so far. I am enjoying being here, so thank you for holding it, and thank you for inviting MeTIP to speak at it. So I just want to start today by giving a brief overview of what we are at MeTIP. So MeTIP stands for Monitoring and Evaluation of Trafficking in Persons. And we are a community of practice of M&E and research staff that focus on TIP programming. As a group, we started in 2015, and we meet 4 times a year. And we meet to share best practices, strategies, and ideas to try and advance the field of monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning in the anti-trafficking space. We have over 75 members from NGOs, governments, universities, and research institutions. And IJM is the current and second secretariat of the group, which is why I am speaking with you today. As a group, we have had a variety of accomplishments in the last 3 years that I just want to talk about. First of all, we have collaborated to help create and validate and increase the use of various tools, including IJM's Assessment of Survivor Outcomes and Free the Slaves Community Maturity Tool. We have also had members come together to help co-evaluate a number of initiatives. For example, Free the Slaves and Westat work together on Ghana's Child Protection Compact. And we've had panel presentations at the last 2 American Evaluation Association conferences, and we have created 3 white papers that were just designed to provide recommendations and encouragements around monitoring and evaluation and holistic program design. So today I just want to talk about some 3 high-level recommendations that have been suggested by the MeTIP community of practice. And I'll be fairly high level, and then I know my colleagues on the panel will be going more into detail on some of the specific topics that are broadly covered by this. So first of all, we want to really encourage organizations to lay a strong foundation for monitoring and evaluation. And this is for the organizations actually implementing the programs, as well as funders and the research community in the anti-trafficking field in general. We need to see holistic programs with comprehensive theories of change that recognize all of the various root causes and interconnections between them, and have a clear idea of what that particular program can impact, and that way we can measure what we are actually trying to impact specifically. We would also really like to see the creation of sentinel indicators of program success. So I think most of our programs are created with the idea that we want to see a reduction in the prevalence of trafficking. That is the goal. But measuring the prevalence of trafficking is incredibly difficult, very expensive, as we've talked about earlier today, and it's really not realistic for many of our programs, especially when there's a 1 or 2 year program funding cycle. It's just not realistic. And so we'd like to see if we can identify sentinel indicators that show success is happening, we're moving in the right direction, without requiring programs to do full prevalence measures. We would also really love to encourage the funding and implementation of strong learning mechanisms within programs. So we talked earlier today about sort of the ethics of funding, monitoring, and evaluation, and what percent, and all of those things. And I would just argue that, especially if we fund monitoring and more formative and developmental evaluations, then we are actually doing evaluation that helps to improve the program as it goes so that the program can be more cost-effective, more efficient. And so it's not just waiting till the very end to see was the program successful or not, and should we continue funding it? It's actually measuring as we go along so that we can make sure that our programs are successful. And then we would love to see more validated tools and methods, and we talked about this morning that many of those things are being created, and we are very excited about that. Our second broad recommendation is just to be flexible, realistic, and strategic in measuring impact. So there is actually a bit of a debate amongst the METIP group regarding the appropriateness of measuring prevalence in many programs. We just feel like many programs just don't have the resources to do it. And often we find that there's sort of pressure to measure prevalence before there's a realistic expectation that change could have happened, especially when you consider that the way we measure prevalence is by saying, in the last year, has this happened? Anytime you're measuring prevalence at the end of a program, you're ignoring the past year of what has happened. And so if we are going to measure prevalence, we need to do it really strategically, plan the timing of it well, and just make sure we're thinking through all of that. It's similar with impact evaluations. They're important. We do need more of them in the field to know for real what has happened when considering counterfactuals and all of these different things. But again, it's probably not realistic for most organizations to do that, and so we would not want to see that be a requirement. We also want to encourage the use of other evaluation forms, such as developmental evaluations and formative evaluations, to encourage different kinds of learnings. And finally, we just want to encourage all programs to ensure good principles and practices for data collection are in place. So we need to make sure always that the protection of victims is first and foremost. And I think there are, and we need to get more survivor and community voice to make sure that we're not just following sort of the bare minimum of ethics, but really treating people in the way that they want to be treated, in ways that do not feel exploitative to them, because of course they have already been exploited, and we would never want to unintentionally re-exploit them in some way. Getting the input of survivors and communities also just helps us to make sure that we're collecting the right data, because often they know better than we do what is important to measure. And then we just want to ensure that all data is properly interpreted and used. So number one, make sure that data is used, and that we are measuring things in uniform, standardized ways so that we can tell, was this program more or less effective than this other intervention? If we're all measuring our programs completely differently with completely different measures of success, it's really hard to know what is helping and how. So I will just wrap it up there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, thank you very much for that very helpful presentation on the importance of laying strong foundations and being flexible, realistic, and strategic. and ensuring that good principles and practices are followed. Our next presenter that I have the pleasure to introduce is Catherine Bryant. Catherine has worked in the modern slavery sector for the past decade, and prior to coming to the Walk Free Foundation, she has a long and distinguished history working with international organizations and with NGOs, including Save the Children and UNICEF. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Graham. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Maurice, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about our work at the Walk Free Foundation. I'm not actually going to be talking about the Global Slavery Index, which we launched this morning, but talking about another project that we've been working on over the last few years. Today I'm going to be talking about something that we call the Promising Practices Database, which we launched earlier this year. Yes, there we are, that way. So the database was born out of one of James's questions in the opening session, one of those simple questions that policymakers ask of what works, what should we do, and what should we fund to try and end modern slavery. And we started thinking about that from the sense that there have been a lot of programs, there have been a lot of projects that have been implemented over the last few decades. So surely there must be some information within the evaluations of those programs which would give us the answer to that question of what works, as well as also what doesn't work. We therefore wanted to identify key lessons learned, looking at what we can do to tackle all forms of modern slavery, be it anti-slavery initiatives or counter-trafficking. So put really simply, the Promising Practices Database is a searchable database of evaluations of anti-slavery and counter-trafficking programming from the last 15 or so years. There are also a series of policy papers which we've developed looking at this database, looking at particular forms or particular sectors of slavery. We are currently building those out at the moment. There are a few of them that will be available on the website, and we're looking to develop that as we go forward. So the Promising Practices Database aimed to answer these three questions, which is what do we already know about what works, what should we scale, and what don't we know what works, which is obviously equally as important as what does work. A brief note on methodology. We conducted systematic searches of online databases, looking at UN, ILO, UNODC, IOM, primarily, academic databases, as well as Google Scholar, to identify these evaluations. We started looking, to begin with, by just looking at existing evaluations of trafficking and slavery initiatives. But we then later extended this to look at other forms of exploitation. For example, we included child labour, FGM or FGC, as well as early marriage. And the reason behind this is that we thought that there must be some additional lessons that can be learned from looking at those particular sectors. Once we had pulled all those evaluations together, we did a little bit of a review of the titles, abstracts, to identify the most relevant evaluations, and then pulled those together and removed any that either were just program descriptions, didn't give us any explicit methodology of how the evaluation was conducted, or were duplications. So within the database, we ended up with about 179 evaluations. These were then categorized and tagged by the taxonomy that you can see on the screen in front of you. Sitting behind each of these terms are a list. Each of these categories are a list of terms which were predetermined or were determined from the evaluation itself. So, for example, if an evaluation said it was a trafficking program, we would tag that as trafficking. If it said it was dealing with the brick kiln industry, then we would tag it as brick kiln. We were quite generous with those categorizations because what we wanted to do was to give kind of the optimal search terms for people who would be using this database. We wanted people to be able to find as many evaluations as possible based on the search terms that they were putting into this database. There is a second step to this, which then where we, when we're doing our policy papers, we look at those buckets of terms and actually do a bit more of a deep dive to see whether those evaluations can tell us anything in particular to try and draw out those lessons learned. So the database looks like this. And so it is housed in EndNote. It's available on our website, freely available. Each of the evaluations has its usual bibliographic information, as well as those terms, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And you can search by, for example, programs that are all based in India that are looking at forced labour, and then you'll be able to create a group of those evaluations to then look at those in a bit more detail. So what did it tell us? So from those 179 evaluations, we found that the majority actually looked at human trafficking programming. Now, that's part of the way in which that we did our systematic searches and the relationships we had with various organisations working on trafficking programs. But that was the highest number. It should actually say 90 on there. The next, obviously, were child labour and also programs that looked at migration. When looking at sector, sex work, domestic work and agriculture were the most commonly defined sectors. There's a really interesting subgroup of mainly trafficking programs which didn't actually have a sector specified. And by that I mean it was very unclear which particular sector where the exploitation occurred was actually being tackled by the program. The program was described as a trafficking program, but the actual problem wasn't elucidated more than that. We then obviously looked at the types of methodology. Again, by far the majority of these evaluations are post-evaluations based on a qualitative review, mainly looking at the program documents, conducting some interviews with people who'd implemented the program, and then drawing conclusions based on that. We did find some more robust evaluations, but these were mainly in the child labour space, or in some cases looking at child marriage as well. There's very few that would come purely under the modern slavery umbrella. Again, these were determined by what was written in the evaluation itself. We didn't try to determine what the methodology was. So then, what were our main findings and our recommendations, our conclusions from all of this? We do know that information exists. We're not starting from ground zero. There is a lot of information that we can draw on in order to determine what doesn't work. One of the key things from doing this work was the importance of transparency. We're really lucky that we were able to access evaluations that actually aren't publicly available. And you can get access to them if you ask for them, but it's knowing that those exist in the first place in order to be able to get access to them. So it is really important that organisations feel comfortable sharing their findings, both about what works but also what doesn't work, because there's no point us keep doing the same things over and over again if we know it's not working. It's also important for us, I think, to improve underlying project design. Often in the evaluations you would find that the evaluator would find it very, very difficult to actually determine what worked because the objectives were either unclear or very unrealistic of saying we're going to end trafficking in this particular country or sector in the space of a 12 or 24-month program. So it's really important that those objectives and the outcomes that are put into log frames in the start of programs are really realistic and also very clear so they can be measured and tracked during the course of the project. Linked to that is this importance of embedding project evaluation within project development cycles. We all know those cycles, but it's making sure that is really first and foremost. So it's not just a kind of add-on done at the end of the project. And also that can be seen as a flexible approach where you can revisit objectives and also build on lessons learned from monitoring evaluation and build that into your project design. There is obviously a need for capacity building and support for drafting evaluations within project proposals. It must be a kind of an addition to actually implementing the project itself. And then we also found that some of the evaluations that were coming out were very opaque. It was very hard to actually determine what the evaluation was trying to tell us. There are a couple of examples of where we, if you read the executive summary and the conclusion, you would conclude that the project was a great success, but if you actually read the whole document, it was not necessarily the case. So it's really important that there are these tools in place that can actually provide that guidance to both doing the project itself, but also doing the monitoring and actually writing up of this evaluation. I think I will leave it there, and there's probably some questions that we can answer on that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for a really illuminating presentation. Our next presenter is Yuki Lo, who is with the Freedom Fund. Yuki leads the fund's work to measure the impact of investments in countries with the highest incidence of slavery as well as supporting research and knowledge sharing with the broader anti-slavery community. She's currently supervising research projects in Ethiopia, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Thailand on forced labor, child labor, forced marriage, and sex trafficking. And Yuki, you seem extraordinarily busy with that portfolio. Please.
All right. So thanks, everyone. And I actually think that, I mean, without disrespecting the previous panel, I think this is where it's really exciting. I don't know, you know, trying to measure change on a project level and really trying to answer what works. So I actually think that this is a great session to have after lunch because it's, you know, it's a lot to talk about. So at the Freedom Fund, what we do is bring together NGOs in high prevalence countries. So at the moment, we're funding approximately 117 NGOs across 6 countries. And the whole idea is to identify areas, like geographic areas, where there's a high incident of slavery and to bring together different partners to work together. So including frontline services like shelters and counseling, to lawyers who represent victims, to policy advocates, to people who do investigative journalism. So bringing all of those partners together to try and, you know, push forward and try and eradicate slavery in those locations. What I want to talk about today really is the role of civil society organizations in measuring. That I really think that just as no one methodology should dominate the measurement field, I think no one actor should also dominate the measurement field. And I think civil society organizations, or CSOs, really have a really important role to play in helping us design relevant measures, as well as making sure that something actually happens after we share the findings, that actually people on the ground in those communities actually take up the findings and do something with it. But at the same time, I think that we need to recognize that there are sort of advantages and limitations to working with CSOs in measurement. So I just want to highlight some of these today, but also recognizing that, of course, the CSO sector is very diverse. So I don't want to, you know, say everyone is the same. But having worked now with, you know, over 100 CSOs, we're finding some trends that I'd just like to kind of highlight today. I mean, first of all, the advantages. I think that, as I said before, this is where we can really test out what works in many different ways. We can look at different programs. We can look at the effects of, you know, intervention versus no intervention, the different effects between different interventions. And this is also where we can also experiment with new methodology on a small scale before we then, you know, take it up to the national and the global level. So I think this is where we can really start to measure contribution and attribution of interventions. I also think that CSOs have a really important role to play to make sure that these sort of global concepts about what modern slavery is actually relevant to the local context. So for one example is we're just finishing a study on forced marriage of a Burmese woman in China. And so the concept of forced marriage, how do you actually measure that in an instrument? What questions do you ask? When you say, you know, was someone able to refuse the marriage or did they consent? What does that mean? You know, is it that they had to be physically dragged into the, you know, the husband's house? What if, you know, refusing the marriage means that their family is now poorer as a result? Is that, you know, is that coercion? What if it just means that, you know, their parents won't talk to the daughter for a while if she refuses the marriage? And I think these are all concepts that have to be rooted back in the local norms, and that's where we really have to work with CSOs to actually figure out, like, what does slavery mean and where do we draw the line on a very practical level. We also think that CSO have a really important role to play in actually translating the findings into action in the community, and that measurement shouldn't just be for accountability's sake, you know, to report to the government or to donors. I think community themselves can also use measurement to identify their own priorities. So one example is we work with garment workers in South India, and we know that, you know, health issue in the garment sector is quite, you know, it's quite prevalent. But I think by actually getting the workers to note down when they are, what type of injuries they get, how frequently they get injured, how often are they getting sick, that they then start to self-realize that this is actually a real problem in their own workplace. And then they will then bring that up to the supervisors of those factories. And again, you know, I think that's what action should be all about, communities identifying what's important to them rather than, you know, I must say, we also fund NGOs. Shouldn't be up to the donor to dictate those priorities. So that's why I think NGOs really have an important role to play in measurement. But at the same time, I think that we should also recognize their limitations. One is objectivity. Often, if you're doing the work, it's very hard to then assess your own work. So I think we need to be careful about how we use NGOs. I think where it's a formative type of measurement to try and analyze the problem, I think that's where NGOs can play a really important role. But if you're then trying to do sort of pre and post measure and looking at the effectiveness of programs, then maybe you do need someone to bring in an objective lens about that, so that they don't just end up talking to their favorite schools or their favorite participants to detect change. Another thing that they definitely need help with is improving the rigor of their research. And I think that we need to recognize that CSOs are great at delivering, what they do best, which is often frontline activities or doing advocacy, but they're not researchers. So I think we need to be realistic when we are funding civil society to do measurement. And I'm sure all of you have a lot of interaction with CSOs. It's very rare that they decline funding. So if you often offer them money, they will say yes to measuring anything. And I think we just need to be really realistic about, their skill sets. And lastly, packaging findings. I think often, because they're working at such micro level, they tend to frame the issue in a very local context, and then it becomes less useful for sort of government stakeholders and so on, or the media, because it's rooted in such kind of a small scale geographical location. So I think that we can often offer them a lot of help in helping them make those findings relevant to a broader level, whether that's subnational or national or even regional level, so that we can actually try and draw on a whole kind of pool of findings and kind of influence policy that way. So where do we go from here? Well, I certainly think that CSOs have a key role to play. But I think that we need to be really honest with ourselves and be empirically minded. I think that we need to encourage NGOs who have the courage to tell us what doesn't work, because at the moment they often get slapped down. We stop funding them. There's a lot of fear about disclosing results that aren't working. And I think we all need to be honest about actually encouraging disclosure when things don't work. And secondly, I do think that we need to be realistic about the role of NGOs. They shouldn't replace researchers, but at the same time, researchers also really need to engage them to develop methodologies and instruments that are actually relevant to the local context. And finally, I think that we often are quite extractive in how we do measurement. We do a lot of data collection, it goes back up, and it may have some national event, but it's very rare that we disseminate back with the CSO community or those affected communities. And I think that, it would be great if we make sure that we have time and line in the budget to make sure that we translate the finding back in the local language and take those findings back to, community conversation, to make sure that those who are affected actually know what is happening in their own community and what is being said about them. So I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Rachel, thank you very much for a truly wonderful presentation. Our last presenter is Andrea Nicholson, who is the Associate Director of the Rights Lab at University of Nottingham, Beacon of Excellence. She works with law enforcement, governments, NGOs, and survivors of slavery, doing research on the history, culture, literature, and psychology to interpret law and frameworks surrounding contemporary slavery, with a particular focus on analyzing what survivors and experiences mean for the development of legal definitions and the effectiveness of government policies and strategies. So with that brief introduction, Andrea, over to you.
So just to clarify, within the Rights Lab there are 14 different research themes that are umbrellaed under 4 overarching programs, and I lead a program on survivors' voices. And as part of that, we have been employing participatory action research, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So it's slightly different, but it does follow on quite well from the other presentations. And we're using that to look at what other SDGs impact modern slavery, what survivors' definitions of slavery and forced marriage are, and also to look at their perceptions and the issues they face in their journey from discovery through to sustained liberation. So dominant models of research impact tend to see that as a linear process based on a donor-recipient model, with survivor participation occurring at the end of the project following the take-up and use of findings. And participatory action research challenges this approach by employing survivors to collaborate in that research at every stage. So there's an emphasis on hearing survivors' voices and valuing their exclusive knowledge and expertise, so valuing them as more than just victims and survivors. And they are employed as co-researchers who participate in the framing, the design, conduct, analysis, and authoring of research. So they are there from the very start of the process to the end. And because with participatory action research, changes are made throughout the process, and further research is undertaken and methods adjusted, so there's a constant cyclical review. The model is adaptable, it's flexible, it allows for a restructuring and refining of method and data as the research progresses. I'm sorry, this is not... So an example of that is Survivor Journeys, which is the project I mentioned where we're tracing survivors' journeys from discovery to sustained liberation. And as part of that, we are working with survivors from the outset and with the Survivor Alliance, whose logo is up there, which is a new global network of survivors that offers training, consultancy, and expertise. And we're using this method to trace those journeys to reveal what we don't yet know, rather than trying to reconfirm what we do know about the difficulties that survivors encounter. In particular, we're looking at those points where survivors choose not to enter any central support mechanisms that exist, and what happens to them afterwards, and what the degree of re-trafficking, homelessness, and crime is, and what ways we can prevent that or at least reduce that from occurring. Sorry, I keep pointing at them. So there are challenges to this approach. I'm sure there are people here thinking, how on earth can we include these people? Because in one respect, there is this initial investment that has to go in. Training has to go into the process. You'll see in Mindang's letter in the GSI report on page 18 that there is a move to ensure that survivors are employed as co-researchers and as consultants. So we're not asking them to come and do it for free. They are being valued for their expertise. And that has obviously a financial problem. It causes a financial problem for a number of institutions. But the value of employing them in this way and of incorporating them in the research from the start, I think is worth that investment. And usually it's a case of restructuring where your costs are going rather than having to find more. Participatory action research is also less well understood and not as commonly used. So that's in part because it's embedded in the research process. It's partly because it's currently underemployed and the appreciation of its value and its outcomes is less known. And there are the resource implications to its use. The changes that occur as a result of that cyclical process also cause challenges. They often extend the research period, which can cause resource problems for organisations. And it does sometimes mean you have to alter the data you're collecting and the analysis midway. So survivor participation also brings its own challenges, and it's important not only to fund their participation as co-researchers, but there is a risk of re-traumatisation. You have to be very careful and very sensitive to their particular needs, and also the training that they might need, which doesn't just involve the academic training, but in terms of presentation and so on, where they might be confronted with questions that aren't related to the research. But the value of participatory action research that we've found is that it's worth the cost and the effort. An explicit aim is to develop the skills, confidence and solidarity among community-based co-researchers through doing research together. So it's not just academic researchers with survivors, it's about bringing this collaborative network together. And we found that it results in collective impact, generating multiple organizations working together strategically to achieve social change with co-designed interventions. And those interventions tend to be quite innovative and effective because survivors have been part of that process from the outset. It improves the relevance of the research in its design, and it enables research to have a broader and deeper reach, particularly in collecting data from hard-to-reach individuals and groups who might be suspicious of outside researchers. The outcomes are well constructed, they are sensitized with a greater likelihood of sustainable impact, and it can also lead to consciousness raising and empower communities to question dominant ideas and interests, and mobilize knowledge for their own benefit, affording activists and affecting individuals and populations by giving them valuable data in support of their political demands. It results in skills and knowledge gains in all parties, not just in survivors. And it challenges us to reconsider our methods and outcomes. So Yuki mentioned that it's often difficult to assess your own work, and we need an objective lens. And in one study, the organisation using participatory action research noted that when survivors gave feedback and criticism, it was like a cold shower, but that it helped them to reflect on their practice and amend their methods. So it also builds organisational confidence in results and brings credibility to the results that improve the potential for impact and further funding. So finally, just to finish with the findings that we've had, or the outcomes, if you like, of using participatory action research. One example is the potential that it has to reveal the prevalence of hidden slavery. As a consequence of one of the studies we've been conducting, it's given us insights into the needs of a particular group of survivors, and we have found there are greater instances of male sexual slavery than is currently understood, and it may be closer to 8% than the 1% currently estimated. Another finding concerned post-discovery support structures and survivors' perceptions of what was core to sustained freedom. And they said that was actually more dependent on their post-liberation condition, beyond the release from slavery and the immediate critical needs being met, such as money, accommodation, and work. And that sustained liberation for them was significantly improved where they were facilitated to build community and feel a sense of belonging. So that, for us, is a very valuable piece of knowledge that would help us to design strategies and interventions and local strategies in partnership with civil organisations and with government to ensure that if we can build that community structure around individuals, then the potential for them to fall into re-trafficking, criminal action or homelessness could be significantly reduced. So just so you have the link, in case you're interested in the Survivor Alliance and you would like to contact them, that's their link in the middle. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so very much. So we began by hearing from Rachel and making some very important recommendations from the METIP group. Catherine shared with us the very useful database that they have developed and made some recommendations around the improvement of transparency, project design, and called for more rigorous evaluation. Yuki gave us some really good insights into the importance of project level, community level involvement, and being willing to acknowledge failure, and both the advantages and the limitations of being involved with local organizations. And finally, Andrea talked to us about the importance of participatory action research and survivor involvement. Before turning it over to the group, I want to highlight a potential tension or contradiction actually among the panelists that I'd like to ask you to address. That on the one hand, there seemed to be a call for what I would call more classically rigorous evaluation design. There's very little use, according to the database that you shared with us, Catherine, of participatory action research. Andrea, on the other hand, you pointed to the absolute salience of involving those most affected. and that the methodology for doing that is participatory action research. And it seems to me there's a tension in there between those perspectives. I'd like to hear you address what you perceive as that tension.
So I think it's obvious that we all need to recognise that we can't expect every institution to employ participatory action research from now in every research project they have. But I think the insights and the innovative suggestions and strategies that survivors can bring are valuable to any research project, whether they're brought in throughout with participatory action research or whether actually they are evaluating towards the end of the research or feeding back. I think the important thing is that we try in every way possible to include survivors as much as we can because of the capacity there is for us to understand unknown and hidden aspects of modern slavery and of estimation that we might have missed.
I would say that it's not necessarily a tension, and actually it's quite a good thing. And actually having multiple forms and multiple methods of doing evaluation will give you different answers based on the questions that you're asking. So I think it's about defining what research questions you're trying to answer and then tailoring the methodology that you will use the best methodology in order to answer that question. So I don't necessarily see it as a tension. I see them as kind of all the different approaches as different tools that we can use in our toolkit in order to track progress towards different questions.
Thank you. Rachel, would you care to comment?
There we go. Okay. Yes, so I agree with Catherine that I think we need all of these different methods, and I think we need to recognize that there is different capacity and different need for different kinds of evaluations at different points in time and for different projects, and that it is, I think the critical thing is for us to define what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. As Catherine pointed out, many evaluations were unclear as to what exactly they were trying to achieve, and so that makes it hard to know if we have succeeded. And so we need very clear theories of change, and we need coherent evaluations that are very clear about the methods and what they are trying to achieve.
Thank you. Yuki.
Yeah, I also think, it's not so much attention. I think let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we should all be using different approaches. And obviously, we need the rigorous measurement because, at the end of the day, we need sort of to see whether change is actually taking place. And you can't always do that through participatory methods. But where the community really adds value is looking at how they can formulate solutions in those specific contexts. And I think that's where participatory methods, really excel at formulating solutions.
Thank you very much. All right, let's have some questions and comments from the audience. I will ask you to be succinct, please, and please do introduce yourself in case not everybody knows everyone else. So, James, why don't we? Okay, I won't ignore those behind me. Okay, so sir in the corner.
finer-grained industry levels. As someone who's trying to present this data to corporate supply chain type customers who are interested in evaluating their supply chains, they're interested in seeing progress at the specific industry levels. So, say the agriculture sector is not specifically.
Thank you. Let me take two more comments or questions, and then we'll move on. Jesse.
Hi, Jessie Brunner with the Honda Center for Human Rights at Stanford. First, I just want to acknowledge this awesome all-female panel of researchers. That was really nice to see. And then my question sort of came off of what Yuki said about how we can't expect civil society organizations to be researchers, and I totally agree. But I've also, in my research, seen a lot of examples of civil society organizations like Cecilia's, if she's still in the room, who are really data-driven in their work. And so I think I'm wondering like what we can learn from those sort of positive deviances or outliers that are really being evidence-based or data-driven and how they design and implement their programs. Any examples that you have to share, and then also Yuki, you mentioned sort of feeding Freedom Fund's findings back to the community. If you have any sort of case studies that you can share about how you've seen organizations take that up and work with it and push it out.
Great. Thanks, Jesse.
All right. So not Paul, U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, as well as engaged with building excellent platforms for Delta 8.7. My question is, how are we addressing statistical biases, specifically when the majority of programs and research that's being pulled from is self-reporting from programs that are only dealing with certain victim populaces? Are we weighting the marginalized populaces to try and correct those numbers? When working with survivors, are we working with survivors with the capacity and the healing to actually be able to address the nuances of the gaps in the research to make sure the research is pure and not systemically biased according to the victims that we see as legitimate victims as opposed to, and that's open for everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Why don't we take those in order? I have been reminded to ask people who ask questions, particularly in the back, to please use a microphone because the event is being webcast and then they can't hear what the question or comment was. Okay. So who would like to start with a response to our friend Brian regarding more greater granularity about the research that's done? Please.
I think it would just be to agree and echo your comments. Obviously, there is a need for having broad brush understandings of what does and doesn't work, but the more granular we can be with that information is probably more useful. We've been looking at supply chain transparency. We've been doing a project looking at the statements that are being produced under the UK Modern Slavery Act, for example, and so it's been really helpful for us to be able to drill down into specific sectors to try and identify the impact of that piece of legislation. So yes, I completely agree that there is a need to balance both these high-level, broad brush understandings as well as this more sector-specific, kind of more detailed recommendations about what works.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment? Yuki, please.
Yeah, I think so. We also work in Thailand in the seafood sector, and we are trying to work with multinationals on their recruitment of foreign migrant workers. And I mean, we would love to, but it's again getting access and getting freedom to go and talk to different types of workers, not just the ones that the supervisor points us to. So I think it's a bit of coming together is needed. That we would love to do more sector-specific research, but I think we need more support in terms of, accessing a so-called, a variety of respondents to try and inform our work.
Thank you. Responses to Jesse's question about what we can learn from positive examples of NGOs that are using data effectively.
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, I think, there's a big variety of NGOs, so I don't want to, say that this applies to all of them. And there are some really good positive deviants that are very data-driven and kind of uses their data to identify risk factors, protective factors, using it for advocacy. I think it really then depends on the scale and whether or not those NGOs have enough sort of resource to professionalize that function. Often when we are working in a lot of the frontline organization, we're really talking about, small scale organization with an income of, 10 to 50,000 a year. So they don't really have resources to hire someone who can deal with data in a technical sense. But I agree, and I think that speaking to sort of Harry Cook's platform, how we can make sure that we pull together the data that comes from different NGOs so that we can analyze trends across them is really important.
Just to really quickly jump in on that and to echo that point, we would absolutely love to build out the number of evaluations we have and also to make sure everybody's voice is reflected in that. Obviously, when we did the systematic review, we were tied to what was publicly available or what we could get access to. So if there is a way that we can bring those positive deviants into that platform and learn from that, I think that would be a great step forward. So if anyone has any evaluations they're willing to share, please send them through because we would love to include them in the platform.
Rachel?
Yes, I would just like to add that I think in addition to really improving the data that we have in evaluations, one thing to really encourage within programs is just the idea of evaluative thinking, not just from our M&E staff in a program, but from the entire staff. That will encourage people to be looking for data throughout the program to see, are things working? Can we change and adapt as we go along to make the program better? And really to have that evaluative thinking skill from our program staff who know the on-the-ground realities and can really interpret things best is a big win that I think we see from data-driven NGOs.
And now if we could respond to our colleague asking about statistical biases from self-reporting.
I've probably spoken too much already. I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I think that's where we really need to ensure there is rigor in a lot of what the CSOs are measuring, because yes, what we find is that they will tend to go to their favorite clients or go to the most traumatic client and try and collect stories from them. And I think a lot of what we do when we work with CSO is to make sure that there is a more representative or at least diverse sampling, that they go to people who are participating in their program, but then forcing them to deliberately go and talk to people who have chosen not to participate and understand, why is it that they've chosen to do their own thing. So I think that's a area definitely that requires improvement, and one where I think we have a role to play in supporting NGOs and making sure that we partner them with people with the technical skills who can make sure that we have less of a biased sample or to reweight where necessary. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrea?
Using survivors in your research at whatever stage will make a big difference to your ability to access information and understanding from survivors about what is affecting them and actually who is being affected. And you're right, you do often see, regular people coming up who are willing to tell their story and to give the information. I think sometimes it's also not about telling their story. It's about speaking to them as a participant in the research rather than somebody who will explain their trauma. And as soon as you start using survivors in your research, employing survivors in your research as researchers, then you do suddenly have access to a lot more researchers, a lot more survivors who are willing to participate in a way they might not have been if you had approached them. And also, survivors, if involved at the very start of the research, if at any point, will help you to construct the research and to devise questions that are sensitive to participants' needs and to their histories. And as such, you can avoid what might seem some quite innocuous but very prohibitive questions or phrasing that might deter a survivor from participating. And they will help you construct ways of interviewing or ways of gathering that data that you might not have considered to have been more sensitive or to have appealed to that particular group. So I think in certain groups groups or ethnicities of survivors will in particular be more willing to, in my experience, be more willing to speak as a group than as individuals, ensuring anonymity, making sure that support is there. These small things that perhaps we don't think about at every stage can make a big difference to survivor participation. And with survivor participation, you start to get the more nuanced understanding of who is being affected.
Thank you. Okay. Let's open the floor again for some more interventions. James.
Thanks, Maurice, and thanks to the panelists for wonderful presentations. I think it's just happenstance in a sense that we have civil society organisations presenting on project-level impact. We could equally ask these same questions of government-level or government-backed projects, of course. But I think the holy grail that we're looking for here, to come back to your point, Maurice, about harmonisation, is thinking about how we connect up the learning from project-level or community-level work to government-level policy, to global-level policy. And so my question for the panel, my first of two, if I may, is what are the actual variables that we should be harmonizing or standardizing across project evaluations to make them more comparable and to begin to connect them up to those other areas of policy, or to come back to Sean's point earlier in the day, to business practice? You know, what are the actual variables that you would like to see as a first order priority, more of these project level evaluations including? And then second, just connected to thinking about how we might do that, do we need to be thinking about some kind of standardized taxonomy of variables? And how do we learn about doing that? I mean, sometimes in our, we all have a lot that we're wrestling with. There is a danger that we lapse into parochialism and that we don't think about who has done this before, who has been in this not quite terra nullius before, if I can put it that way. I was so pleased to hear, Rachel, that you've been presenting this work at the, I think you said, American Evaluation Association. You know, there must be many other national and global epistemic communities, professional associations, learned associations that we could be engaging with, whether it's statistical communities, the business and human rights community, the development community, who frankly probably already have answers to many of these questions. Now, we need to come up with the specific questions that are relevant to our areas of policy, but who are the associations and the other communities we should be looking to? So that's my second question or challenge to you as a panel. Who are those associations and epistemic communities that we should be engaging with, and how, for example, can the Alliance help you do that?
Thank you very much, James. Who would like to start the response to James and Mahesh? Oh, this is not a bashful group.
I have a very short answer, which may not be popular, but I think we all strive to try and find consistency in things, but this is an issue. Modern slavery is an issue that is deeply complex, and I actually don't think standardization is necessarily valuable or capable of being applied where there are so many variances from country to country, type to type, ethnicity, with cultural issues. I think it would, I'm not sure whether it would solve any problems without creating more, if that makes sense. I don't know if you all agree.
Interesting.
Slightly more optimistic view. I mean, yes, I think if we are going to have standardized ways of collecting data, whether it's on victims or, say, participants of activities, I think it has to be an opt-in model. So, if you choose to record school attendance data, these are the ways you could record it. If you want to record hours of work or forms of exploitation, here are the options that you can choose to use. But I think we must not get into a top-down model where these are the mandatory fields, because then ultimately, it ends up being not useful to most organizations, and so the whole system gets abandoned. So I think definitely I would love to see more sort of coming out with the shared projects with Polaris and IOM and Liberty Asia in terms of building a common taxonomy of data. But yeah, let's make sure that we don't mandate it. But on the other hand, I think on the measurement side, I do think that there is actually a lot that is being shared amongst the research community. And as I said, I'm guilty of this as well. We don't always put it on our website because often we are not allowed to share the fact that we are actually doing these studies. So it's not just like you can do a Google search and pull up the instruments, but actually, behind the scenes, I know everyone on this table, we actually share a lot of our survey instruments and interview guides and so on to try and at least standardize some of the questions that we're gathering across projects.
Just to build on both of those points, I don't necessarily have the answer to here are a list of variables that we should be looking at based on the work we've done. But there's definitely definitely in building and trying to tag these evaluations and put them into groups was a lot more complicated than I first thought. I thought naively when we first started doing this that it'd be great, there would be clear different types of projects that we could just group together and then everyone would use and have a common understanding of those types of initiatives. And when we first started doing it, it worked for the first probably 100, unfortunately, quite a few evaluations, and then we had to go back to the beginning and actually restart and relook at it. And so one in particular, looking at types of programs, is one of the categories that we had and the term list that we developed. And we actually went back to the programs themselves and broke them down into their component activities, then looked at commonalities across those activities and then regrouped them back into groups that way. So there are some lessons learned in how we developed our taxonomies that then might also apply to developing those variables or those indicators. But I don't think we're quite at the stage yet where we will definitely have a pre-agreed or we'll all come to the conclusion of what these variables should be. I do think that talking, as Yuki was saying, about the complexity of this and having like a toolkit or a suite of these different variables would be a great first step, and it would be interesting for the Alliance to start working on that, of developing it and looking at different types of interventions and also of forms of exploitation.
Please, Rich.
Yeah, I'll just add, I do think, I agree that it would be great to have a suite of tools that we can use and even some qualitative tools that look at, community experience, survivor satisfaction. It won't be the exact same questions everywhere, but to say, here are guidelines for how you might measure this. Here are things you might want to consider. And then I also think about just very broad concepts like the 3 Ps, right? Like protection, prevention, prosecution. What is protection? Does anybody have a way of measuring that that is meaningful and standardized? I am not aware of one. Prosecution, what do we expect from the government? Is there sort of a minimum standard that we're looking for that can help us to see how our government's responding to this issue? Those aren't necessarily program specific, but I think they would help to inform programs as to how they can be helping the communities.
Thank you. James, would you like to follow up on this? I'm watching you.
Thank you, Maurice. I'll try to be brief. I don't want to give the impression that I'm advocating a top-down one-size-fits-all / one-size-fits-none measurement methodology. What I was suggesting is that if we don't have common scientific language and variables, it is very hard to deliver science or frankly impossible, and therefore impossible to give policymakers a rigorous evidence base on which to make choices. So let me give you an example of the kind of variable that I'm talking about. Age. Mm-hmm. It would be very useful if all program evaluations knew the ages of the, for example, beneficiaries. Now, you might say, well, that's ridiculously obvious or ridiculously uncontroversial. That's my point. There must be some list of uncontroversial variables that we could encourage collection of, and then we move into the more controversial ones, understood. But if we're going to build a rigorous evidence base, there is a need for comparability across program evaluations, across policy evaluations. We need to be at some level talking the same language, or we will simply be pouring money and effort and energy and lives down the drain, I would argue. So I know that also Michael was quite agitated by this.
Marcia over there.
Yeah, okay.
I just throw my pen at you.
That's what I do.
Michael.
Just to share that the experience of the ILO when we decided to create a database of all evaluations. So it's only one organization, but we cover many topics from freedom of association to maternity protection. And I guess you're familiar with our database. The fact of coming to a top-down approach, as we do at the ILO, was really helpful to force all evaluation to report on some criteria so that the final user can find useful information quite easily. So there is an added value in forcing people to, but it was developed, of course, after workshops between all departments. But really, we use it. When we look for good practices on other topics, it's quite easy because, yeah, having a common vocabulary it's not standards, one box. It's really using vocabulary and way to describe our evaluation reports that can make the access easier for others. So, and by the way, you can go to this database. It's quite.
Let me get in Marcia's comment and we'll come back. Marcia, please. You were on.
I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, so I just want to agree with James that it is important to have a common set of indicators, at least of measurements that you look at, because age, gender is important when we're developing policy initiatives, and if we can track those across different study, it becomes a little bit more difficult. The other person that I want to agree with is Yuki, because you were saying something really that resonated with me about sharing the results of the research studies, the results of those and findings of those studies back at the local level. But I wanted to ask all of you not only to share the results at the local level, but actually to engage local researchers and academics in the research that you're conducting. We've been trying for a long time to push that it shouldn't just be us here in Geneva or in New York or in Washington actually having these conversations, but actually our researchers in some of the countries that we work with actually engaged at the local level. There are a lot of universities, a lot of research centers, academic students that are interested in this issue. And the more that we can use that multiplier effect to get other people interested in what we're doing and doing research at the local level, the more riches the information that we will get, and the finding and the context will be a lot more valuable. So I don't know. I imagine that all of you are already doing this. But if you're not, I will encourage, and I would love to, the next meeting, to have a couple of researchers from those universities, whether it's the Philippines or Thailand or somewhere else, sitting around the table, sharing with us how they're going about conducting research.
Let me give Catherine a chance to respond, and Aidan, I'll come to you.
It's okay. I've completely lost my train of thoughts.
Okay,
so
all
if we
right.
go straight to Aidan, I might remember.
All right, Aidan, please.
Well, James said the word epistemology, so I think that was a bit of a challenge for somebody to say the word ontology. So if we're talking about the epistemology of slavery, how do you get to know what the realities are? It begs the question, what's the ontology of slavery, which is what is the reality of slavery? And Andrea was touching upon it and saying it's very diverse, and I think that's one of the key things about it. But it's not only diverse in the current moment, it's also dynamic, it's also changing. That's one of the reasons that we still have slavery with us, is it's continually changing through time. So if we're careless and have too standardized a form of trying to engage with it epistemologically in order to understand it, then it's going to be changed into very new forms which we won't have the methodology to properly engage with and properly understand. So that's a reason I think we need to be thinking about quite diverse approaches to engage with the question of slavery, because what we're talking about today may well not be what we will be talking about 10 years from now. The second thing I think as well is that there seems to me, I've said this before I think at previous meetings, to be something of a bias in these conversations towards quantitative approaches rather than qualitative approaches. Quantitative approaches are useful to look at useful to use when you relatively well understand a phenomenon. Qualitative approaches are the things that you use when you don't understand a phenomenon. And when we're looking at the issue of slavery in diverse parts of the world, we may understand it in principle, but we don't understand it in the ground level. I just saw this very distinctly whenever I was working in Myanmar this past couple of months, where I can understand quite clearly what the dynamics of slavery are within Myanmar, but what's the dynamics at the community level or indeed within the family level. That requires a much more thorough level of analysis and understanding in order to have any prospect of coming up with measures which may have some possibility of diminishing the phenomena. So it's important that we ensure that the research, the qualitative research that we're doing, is properly undertaken in order to recognize that we need different understandings of what the dynamics of slavery are depending on different contexts. The third thing, I think, is that one of the other slight frustrations yesterday and today, when I say slight, it's really annoying me actually, is that we're not sufficiently talking about the meeting of issues. So we talk about, yesterday we were looking at government by itself by and large, but not adequately talking about the interaction between government and business in terms of, for example, supply chains, because businesses could do everything right and would still have slavery in their supply chains if governments are not doing their jobs. Governments who are doing good things in their own countries need also to be holding other countries to account, otherwise there's not going to be any meaningful change within those countries too. And whenever we're looking at, for example, civil society projects, for all the civil society projects, development projects which are undertaken, the level of impact that they're going to have on the issue of slavery, I wonder, are they measurable at all quantifiably? Because they're all very small projects. And this gets down to the question saying, well, if we're measuring so much and not engaging sufficiently, then are we actually able to justify the quantity that we're investing in the measurement until we are working to a sufficient scale? But one of the things that we need also to be thinking about then is how the lessons of civil society are translated into policy and practice change of government and business. I think that's another area. Those interface areas are important areas for research as well in order to understand what's going on there, what's the constraints by which governments are refusing to do that which is essential in order to end slavery within their domestic situation or indeed within the international environment where they have influence upon. I think that's another crucial area, because we can all listen nicely to ambassadors telling us wonderful things that their countries are doing, but if you scrape a little bit below the surface, you know their policies that they're telling you about are either window dressing or muddles and aren't actually getting down to the core of the issue. And we need to be able to hold them to account on these issues.
Thank you, Aidan. Come. Yes, please.
Is this on? I'm Lauren Dammy from the Department of Labor, and I had one quick question, which for Andrea, which you can feel free to answer afterwards, but it's about like the scope, size, length of period of time, and cost of the studies that you're talking about. And then I have a shameless plug for our office, because we were on the panel, which is that for the past 10 years under the leadership of Marcia, we have been investing in impact evaluations. And not just in impact evaluations, but a number of different ways to measure change within our projects and programs. And these are primarily in the area of combating child labor, but they also include forced labor. So we've probably invested around $16 million in the past 10 years in mostly randomized control trial impact evaluations. So I think a lot of the ones that Catherine mentioned that were in child labor are probably funded by our office. We have about 11 million that is currently active, and we have tons of really interesting results coming out. And like Yuki said, we're not always the best for many different reasons at getting things on our website. However, we are really open to sharing the results of all of our different types of studies, including our impact evaluations. And so we have a lot that are ending this year and at the end of next year. And a lot of these are impact evaluations of government's own programs and policies that we have just provided funding for researchers to help them evaluate. And like I said, these are mostly randomized control trials. But in addition to that, building on what Rachel was talking about with the need for building in good learning mechanisms to projects and programs, over the past about 10 years also, we have really been changing the way that we build measurement and learning into our projects and programs. So we have what we call comprehensive monitoring and evaluation plans, which are basically monitoring and evaluation systems that our projects start designing right when the project is awarded, and then they complete before they even start providing services, so that they can learn up to the outcome level about what's going on with their projects. And then our direct service programs around the world also have baseline and endline surveys, which are probabilistic surveys, area-based prevalence surveys at the household level, usually looking at child labor, and in some cases aspects of the other aspects other than hazardous child labor of the worst forms of child labor. So I just wanted to share that, because if you have any questions or interest in this, we have so many things we could add to this database. And when I heard you talk about it at the METIP meeting earlier this year, I was like, oh, our researchers within our office are going to love that database, because we already have EndNote in our office on all of our computers. So if you have anything that you are interested in learning more about that we are doing, we have a really broad gamut, including impact evaluations that look at vulnerability to trafficking that are really interesting. So that's my shameless plug. Okay, thanks. Since the title was Measuring Impact.
Platform at UNU. That's really great. James, I don't want to lose your point, though, which I think got a little bit lost in the discussion about learning from other sectors, which we really didn't talk about. And Hani, I see you sitting behind me. But certainly, having spent 30 years in the public health arena, I do think that's an example of an area which clearly is a much more intellectually mature field than this one, that did evolve over time. And while it may not be directly applicable, but certainly the presence of widely shared methodologies and indicators was hugely helpful to the very significant progress that was made in improving public health around the world. It allowed us to talk to each other in very meaningful ways about what was and wasn't happening. Whether that's immediately applicable remains to be seen, but I do think that dialogue with other fields is important for this community to really take up. I would like to ask if there are any. We had a couple of interventions, and I want to give the panel space to respond here. If anybody would like to make a comment,
can I just comment on James's comment about learning from others in the field? And this is a shameless plug for METIP. We are meeting next week, and we actually have people from the development field, and I think specifically the health sector, to come and talk to us about what they have done, what they're learning, and how that can be applicable to the field of anti-trafficking. So, should anybody be interested in coming, you can come in person or join online. And just let me know later, and I'll send you the invitation.
I also want to add that, definitely health is one field where we can learn a lot from. The other ones that I think are the women's rights movement and civil rights movement. I think at the moment, a lot of our measurement effort is about sort of direct impact. How many people, how many persons have benefited from our activity, or how many less people are now not in slavery. But we're not talking about how do you create a movement that protects itself and advances their own rights. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about measuring movement building from the women's rights and civil rights movement as well.
And just to echo and kind of build on that, when we first started putting this database together, we limited ourselves to evaluations that had been specifically looking at forms of modern slavery, and then we broadened that out to try and learn from other sectors. So we looked at any programs that were dealing with migration, looking at harmful traditional practices, and that was the one area where we were able to gather a lot of information, particularly looking at early marriage. There's an awful lot of programming that's been done looking at community empowerment models, for example, which have then been proven to have impact on the age of marriage as well. And there's a lot to be said around the use of human rights-based organisation at the community level, which then has flow-on effects on other areas. So there's definitely information out there that can also be applied in this space, and it's kind of broadening that understanding out and being willing to listen to those sectors.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes left, 6-7 minutes. If there are additional, yes, sir. Please introduce yourself.
Waiting for it to turn red. My name is Kevin Hong. I'm from U.S. Department of Labor as well. So in terms of talking about impact, I was curious to hear from different panelists about if you prove that a program is impactful, then the next question is can it be replicated elsewhere in a different context? And also, can it be scaled up? Certain program working in a certain geography or sector doesn't mean that you can transplant this to another country or to another area and be able to successful. Or maybe a program is really effective because it's very hands-on or because it requires a lot of resources, but that means that you cannot scale up at a national level or different to the next level. So how do you approach in measuring impact instead of thinking about external validity as well as scalability?
Thank you. Colleagues.
Thanks for the tricky question, Kevin. I'm going to try and answer half of it. I think the external validity is very hard because the different forms of slavery are so context specific. So I actually don't have an answer for that. But I think in terms of scaling up, I think we don't often look enough at the cost side, and I think it's a really valid question. I think in health and in education, they're really much better at doing cost effectiveness than we are. And one example the way we've tried to do that is looking at mental health intervention, trying to reduce the trauma of victims. And we know that we can't afford to have counsellors in a lot of these rural settings where we work. So we've been trying to basically take a normal approach that was developed in the UK and then take it to Sierra Leone and then adapt it in Nepal and try and strip down elements, looking at what are the core bits that the participants do value and what are the things that they might, could do without, and start stripping back the program to see how we can then get government to start funding it.
Yeah, I'll just add, at IJM we don't have an answer for that, but it is something that we are looking into, and right now we are working on a couple of initiatives. One, we are trying to create some standardized indicators that we measure across all offices, and our goal is to collect some standardized indicator data over a period of years and then look and see, are there certain indicators that in all of our offices show important, meaningful change? And then we're also trying to identify what are the pieces of our program that are most important so that we can kind of get a minimal viable product. Like, maybe we spend this many $1 million on our programs over however many years, but actually if you can make this one change, you can actually make a big difference. And so that is something that we're looking at right now, and we have not yet figured that out. We're just starting the process, but we are trying to identify, is there a specific product or is there a process that we can say, maybe every field office, every partnership looks different, but if you go through this process, it will lead to these changes. And those are things that we're exploring now, but it's very early days.
Very good. Please, Andrew.
In terms of the impact of potential interventions and projects, I think rather than our trying to duplicate interventions that have worked in specific areas, if you look at the meanings behind that intervention and what survivors are feeding back about what it brings to them and what it enables them to do, then you can export that thematic basis to apply an intervention elsewhere that isn't a direct model of the one you have seen or that has been successful, but you identify the underlying need and you find a way to provide that differently. So, for example, the Rights Lab is also undertaking a scoping of global NGO survivor recovery programs. Now, we don't expect to then pull out the best ones and expect everybody to start implementing those identically. But what we are doing with that is building an understanding more thematically about what is working and looking at why those are working, rather than it's because we put in these resources, for example. But we're also then constructing a survivor toolkit so that we're extracting from those programs what survivors can actually take for themselves without cost, and creating a toolkit for survivors. So I think there are ways and means to value and employ aspects of interventions that have been successful and adapt them.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid, my friends, there's a very interesting conversation that we have reached just about the end of the time that's allowed to us. This has been fascinating to really try to think through the different approaches, the methodologies, looking at where the action really takes place, which is at the level of the communities, at the level of the survivors, where people's lives are really affected, and what methods can we use to really assess whether our programs and projects are really making a difference. We've heard a diversity of approaches and opinions here. I think it's been a very rich discussion, and thank you to the audience as well, but particular thanks to our great panelists for a very vibrant conversation. So please join me in thanking our guests.
So good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and go into the next panel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charita Castro, and I am the Chief of the Research and Policy Division in the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. Like our other colleagues, I want to thank the leadership of our Bureau of International Labor Affairs, especially my director over there, Marcia Eugenio, for believing in the value of research for over these last 20 years and how data and statistics can chronicle and address human injustice. So before I go into our panel, I am also going to do a shameless plug before we begin. I think if you all have read our bio, my bio, you wouldn't be surprised, but I'm going to ask you all, have you downloaded our Sweat and Toil and Comply Chain mobile applications? I know everyone here has a smartphone, so these mobile applications cover about 1,000 pages of research on how to end child labor and forced labor. So like Michael, who is channeling her pink to keep us positive, I am channeling wearing light bulbs for inspiration to elevate our work as we think about creative ways to measure change to end child labor and forced labor. For those of you who also know me, you know that I love to tell stories about my mother. And so here's a story about my mother as we were going through the panel today, or the symposium. The story, I'm going to call this the now what story, or so what cha. So when I was growing up, for some reason, and I think it was the immigrant child experience, I would always end my discussions with my mother with, you know what I mean? Hey, Ma, you know what I mean? And one time, she just looked at me and said, Cha, yes, I know what do you mean. You think I'm stupid? So what? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do with the information that you have? So I'm going to call this the So What panel. We know about now how to do the national estimates. We've learned about global estimates and evaluations. So what do we do with all that information? And we have a panel here to talk about how do we use all of this data to affect change? How do we translate that research into action? And without further ado, I'm going to start this panel. We will start with Julia. And Julia is the current project manager of the United Nations Delta 8.7 platform. And she is going to talk about how we bridge the gap between evidence and policy by accelerating scientific study.
Oh, thank you so much. So since it's quite near to the end of the day, and many of you are already familiar with the project, as we've heard from a few people today, I thought I would make a particularly dynamic presentation. So luckily, the technical elements have worked out. So my name is Julia Blocher, and if you have not looked at the lovely fact sheet that we printed for you in your folder today, you will see some more information about Delta 8.7, which is an innovative project of United Nations University that seeks to help policy actors understand and use evidence to adopt policy responses that will contribute to achieving SDG Target 8.7. In the project, we aim to bring together the most useful data, evidence, research, analysis, and news through delta87.org, the global online Alliance 8.7 knowledge platform. And we also aim to take the learnings from the platform and from the project, as well as the best available information and experts in the field, into offline events, including the one that we co-organized with ILO, in which you are currently sitting. And I just wanted to say that we've heard today repeatedly that there's a need for better data collection, for measurement of the scale of the problem and the trends that are at different scales and around the world, and better research into related attributes like vulnerabilities. I don't like the term root causes, but that's been referenced several times today. And so now I'd like to try to connect the dots to the policy level and push us also to think about how we can use what we've discussed today to inform the immediate and effective measures to address human trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, and child labor, which is what the UN member states committed to in SDG Target 8.7. I'm going to try to do all of that by presenting the Delta 8.7 project and then give you a sneak peek of the beta version of delta87.org. So let's see if this works. Aha. So in order to achieve our objective of informing and supporting these effective measures, we at UNU asked ourselves some key questions. We held stakeholder consultations, including with our reference group, which consists of 35 experts in the field. And we conducted a user survey, or rather a survey of potential users of the online platform, for which we received 110 responses from policy actors, researchers, workers' groups, private sector actors, and more. So we looked at the results of this survey and primarily at the responses from the policy actors that we identified and had some interesting results that I wanted to share with you for context. A large majority of the policy actor respondents, 81% actually, had 4 years of experience or less in working at any stage of the public policy process related to modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, or child labor. So by that I mean at any stage of the research, design, drafting, implementation, or review of policies in this field. So overall a relatively young field, and people are relatively new to the field. We also had a somewhat surprising finding that about half of the policy actor respondents are familiar with data and statistics in general, and about another half of them were somewhat familiar or not familiar. Then we looked at barriers of research to policy translation. Oops, sorry, I went too far. And we asked policy actors to give really the main reason why they aren't using the best and latest research and data in their work. And the largest number, as you can see on the far left, said that they don't have the time to digest the data and research that is out there. This, as among other findings, helped to confirm our understanding that policy actors are in general time poor and don't have the time to sort through all of the data sets that are buried around the world on different websites, and they don't have the time to sift through long scientific articles. So we don't need to really provide silver bullets, but we do need to and should be able to compile and digest what is already out there and provide the tools for policy actors to understand the problem as well as to figure out what is working to address it. So in the project, through stakeholder consultations and again in repeated engagement with our reference group, we developed a mission for the knowledge platform to answer some of these questions. And what we came into is that we'd like to scale up the understanding of data and measurement. We want to catalyze evidence-based conversations around modern slavery research and in the community around the world. And we want to strengthen the ability of policy actors overall to evaluate and use evidence to inform their policy decisions. So the mission of the knowledge platform is to be an approachable and credible guide that helps our users, primarily policy actors, but also researchers and other stakeholders, to make these evidence-based policy choices in this field. And this is based on our theory of change, which is to accelerate the generation, exchange, and uptake of scientific evidence and knowledge to inform those effective measures referred to in Target 8.7. And we want to build and expand this global community of policy actors and researchers working in this field, this expert community which Sir Bernard referred to earlier, and in so doing improve the scientific literacy of policy actors overall so that they can identify and support those effective measures. So how did we do this? This is the homepage of the Delta 8.7 knowledge platform, which is now currently in the beta testing phase. So we have 4 main components that I just wanted to briefly go through and also point out the people in the team who have not just only helped to organize this event, but also have been intimately involved in building this platform over the past several months. So we have a data dashboard section, which consists of interactive visualizations, which compares data at the global, regional, and national levels. So we're starting with countries that have signed on to the UK call to action. and we'll build out from there. So we didn't want to tempt the Wi-Fi today, but on the platform, these data visualizations are interactive, and you're able to compare different indicators, zoom in for different, to look at different date ranges, and things of that nature. And this is the domain of Dr. Kelly Gleason, who is sitting over there, and we're very excited about it. Another section of the platform is the policy areas section, which is providing overviews of key policy areas and how they relate to Target 8.7. We like to think of this as a kind of one-stop shop for policy actors. Tell me everything that I need to know about agriculture as relates to Target 8.7. And on the pages, we also provide links to art-related articles and related learning opportunities, which I'll also mention in a minute. And this is also something that our editor of the platform, Maria Sable, who's over here, has been working on very hard. Here is an example of a forum article that we have on the forum section, which is essentially the blog of the platform. So these are short articles by recognized experts on data and evidence, and this is a small plug for Luis, who is coming after me in this panel. And then we have a learning opportunities section, which I won't show you today, I think, but it's a directory of online and offline resources like webinars, podcasts, and events that will also help to expand the user's understanding of different areas that are exposed on the platform. So, since I was asked to also talk about challenges, I wanted to briefly say that one of the key challenges in this project and in this field is learning and understanding how to make this a more useful tool to the stakeholders and to the policy actors. So we really need your help in this, as our aim is truly to make this a useful tool and to help to support those effective measures to achieve Target 8.7. So we're currently in beta testing. We're beginning to have a better idea of how to do that. We still have to answer some hard questions about the best way to organize the information out there in the field and present it with contextual information about data and methods and so on. But we're really excited about it, and we hope that you will help us share this once it is launched formally at the UN General Assembly in September. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. I know there's a lot of anticipation around the launch of Delta 8.7 and how this is used as a tool to also showcase all the work that everyone around the room has been doing. So our next panelist is Miss Alison Campbell, who leads the efforts to combat modern slavery in the Department for International Development at the UK. She's going to talk about how her government is using the data they have in informing and targeting their programmatic efforts. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Charita. I have to say it's quite a tough act, I think, to follow the after-lunch panel, which was one of the livelier after-lunch discussions I've heard, but I will do my best. So I've been asked to speak about connecting evidence to development programming, and I'm going to speak a little bit about our experience in DFID before moving on to think a little bit about the kind of international implications of that. And I just wanted to set the context a little bit here, because this is a really pertinent topic for us in DFID, because unlike Charita and Marcia et al. In the DOL, we do not have years of experience of this. We are a relatively new actor in this space, and we are developing probably about £80 million worth of programming to tackle modern slavery right now. And to be honest, we've struggled with it at first because we're used to working in much more evidence-rich environments. I think that's what our processes are all set up for. Obviously, when we're using ODA, we have to show positive developmental impact on the people we're trying to help. And I think, importantly, something that hasn't really been raised today, we have to also avoid kind of unintended consequences, which is a risk when you're working in evidence-light environments. So when we came into this, we asked all the simple questions that James framed earlier this morning. And we found, as I think we've discussed on the panel previously, there is a lack of robust evidence on what works. I won't go through all of it. It's in the green box. We've just discussed it in quite a lot of length. But it is difficult to program when you're working in such a complex area with interdependencies, so many different possible interventions, and you don't have a good starting point or reliable means of measuring impact, which, by the way, doesn't have to be, as I think has also been pointed out, a reduction in prevalence necessarily. So we found it a real challenge, and we really wanted the information that James was talking about, which was the kind of streamlined, here's what you should do. And sadly, as we all know, that doesn't exist. But at the same time, we didn't want to let the lack of evidence prevent us from acting where we know there's a clear need. So we switched our perspective a little bit to think about, I guess, the bottom two questions on that slide, which is, how do we operate in a limited evidence base, and how do we improve our understanding as well? So coming to the first question, in response to the limited evidence base, we've developed a conceptual framework that we use to guide our work. So it's up there on the slide, and it looks complicated, but it isn't really. It's essentially an attempt to look at modern slavery holistically, which we all know, is hugely complex, and to break it into its constituent parts to help us really identify and prioritise entry points for interventions across a range of different contexts. So it essentially helps us look at, on the left in the purple, vulnerability, who are the vulnerable groups and why. On the right, in the green, what we call permissive environments, which is essentially, what are the structural factors, so it might state, business or society, that help create or reinforce vulnerability to modern slavery. And then in the middle, what we've called the modern slavery industry, which is essentially, the criminal element, what's driving this exploitation. So this is a framework that we encourage all our country officers to use and look at for their specific context and identify which of those individual factors is most relevant in their area. We're using it for some rapid evidence assessments in South Asia and in Africa as well. So we hope to be getting the results of those over the next kind of few months. And it's also helped us guide the development of our theory of change for the DFID investment, the £20 million investment in the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, which you heard Jason talk about earlier this morning, and which is going to focus for us on building the evidence on structural drivers, on the green, as well as kind of piloting interventions to reduce vulnerabilities. So this is basically one of the tools that we use to guide our efforts where evidence is light, and I should say that we're very open to constructive criticism of this, not looking at Aidan or anyone in particular, but if there is anyone with comments, we're more than happy to receive them because we want this to be a useful tool. But I guess moving on to the second part of the question, we also want to use our programming to generate learning, and I think that's really important. Because across all of our programs, we're focusing on evidence as part of the program and not just as an input, because we want to make sure that we can, firstly share the evidence and experience and lessons with others as quickly as possible, but also, I think, importantly, adapt our approach as we go along. And it is actually quite new. It sounds quite strange, but it is quite new for the development community to do adaptive programming, because usually you fix an output and then you work towards that output and you report on that output. But in this instance, what we're trying to do is be adaptive so that we're not so fixed on what outputs we're trying to achieve, and we can adapt them as necessary and as we get feedback from our projects. And again, the best example of the work we're developing on this is with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, where we want to get a better understanding of the drivers and vulnerabilities, but also we're trying to collect as much real-time information as possible and use that to feed back into and inform our approach. So I think just another point I'd make on this slide is it's really important that where evidence is light, that we're honest about the gaps that exist, and we take measures to reduce the risk of the unintended consequences that I mentioned earlier. I think that last bit is particularly important given the vulnerabilities of the people that we're working with. We want our programs to have the impact of reducing vulnerability to slavery, but at the very least we need to make sure that we do no harm where we're working. And then a final point on this slide is, I think, again, linking back to what others have been saying this morning and this afternoon, is we're not going to be afraid to say where something hasn't worked and change our approach, and also make that available to others for their own learning. So that's just a little bit about what we're trying to do at DFID. I guess moving on to some broader international implications, I guess. I think that there are three broad points I'd make about things that we need to do as an international community. And again, I think they echo quite a lot of what has been discussed already today. I mean, one is putting a real focus on evidence as part of planning and programming, and making real efforts, again, as others have said, to monitor and evaluate. I think that's really critical. I think also there was an important point made on scalability and sustainability. I think we need to focus on those aspects as well. The second is, as I just said, to really challenge ourselves to be honest on what's working and what isn't, because that's the only way we're actually going to build the evidence base rather than, just report on successes. And I think the third is to use forums like this and like the knowledge platform that we've just had presented to share as much real-time data and learning as we can. We're committed to doing this at DFID, and we're hoping that we're going to soon be publishing the conceptual framework I showed earlier, making that available to everyone, and we're going to do our best to make the learnings from our other programming available as quickly as we can. So I wanted to end with a point as well that is a bit different, but it is linked. And I would say that modern slavery, I don't think, is yet broadly seen as a development issue, at least not by the development community. We've certainly seen that in the partners that we work with. And I think we'll have a lot more impact if we can mainstream efforts to tackle slavery into our broader development interventions, whether that's social, livelihoods, education. We're trying to do this in DFID, and we need to build up a body of evidence on how to do that and use it to bring the development community along. But I think it also probably links into the point that Charita made earlier, which is that there's probably a lot of untapped information that they have on issues related to the kinds of things that we're trying to deal with, and we need to find a better way of making those links across communities. But I think I'm probably over my time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alison. So earlier, James had made a comment that this symposium today, there was a deliberate effort to bring the child labor community and the forced labor community together, and also sort of echoing Maurice's sentiment that there's a lot that we know already, and how can we bring it in? And especially in the child labor community, we are working many of the times with the same populations. The children who are working and some of them are in bonded labor situations, working alongside with their parents. And so what do we know from the child labor experience and can also be translated to the forced labor and human trafficking experience? So we have Dr. Furio Rosati of the Understanding Children's Work Projects to share with us how he has been directly working with governments to shape their policy and program design. And I took the liberty to specifically ask Furio to speak about one of his examples and how he engaged and his team engaged with the government of the Philippines as they were developing their conditional cash transfers, and how they learned from the governments of Mexico and Brazil in that experience. So, Furio?
Thank you very much. I'm just out of a cold, as you can hear, so I'm little bit grumpy, and so I apologize if I've not shared the optimism that has been flowing from these words. And I will talk a little bit about this example, but let me first make a more general point. I think there is a little bit of excess optimism in assuming that if we are able to monitor, we are able to design policies. And this is a big jump, and in thinking about the first part of the discussion of today, we need to think of ways that goes beyond monitoring, how we can better integrate our knowledge through data, and how this data then can be used to actually design policies. In certain situations, the data we have are not even able to answer the most elementary questions in terms of policy design. So let me give you a few examples. The examples are all positive, Charita, so they're all of what can be done. First of all, the kind of data we need. We need monitoring data that's clear. We have been discussing all the morning about this, but we need data to put the phenomenon. I'm talking about child labor because I don't dare to talk about subjects I'm not very familiar with. We need to put them in the context of the that are relevant for policy decisions. So we need information about labor market conditions, about conditions of the household, about characteristics of the education system, and so on. Let me give you two examples where in expanding the kind of data we collect in this direction, it's really helpful also to answer very simple questions. For example, one typical question that we might know the answer, but we don't have the evidence of the answer is child labor in agriculture. children who are working in agriculture are there because of specific characteristics of the crop production, or because in the agricultural sector there are general situations of vulnerability independent of whatever they happen to be cultivating. Now, this is a trivial question. We might know the answer, but up to a few years ago, a couple of years ago, we didn't have an instrument to test for this. Now there is a new variation of the LSMS surveys that has an extensive part on agriculture that allows finally us to test and to know that it doesn't matter whether they produce cocoa or cassava, more or less there is no technological reason for child labor in differential terms. So this is an example where availability of wider information is useful immediately for policy design. More sophisticated elements, and this was the case many years ago of Cambodia. So while we were doing our work on child labor, there was an issue about designing a crop insurance. So somebody was thinking we need to design a crop insurance system. So fortunately, the data collected at that time had information on shocks, so we could ascertain whether, in terms of child labor, shocks to crop was relevant. And this, of course, had a bearing in the design of policies, at least in the area of child labor. So we need far more, far better data, and sometimes I think maybe we should give up some margin in finesse on monitoring to get a little bit more of the broader view that help us really to design policies. Second point, integration of different data sources. This is a key element. I think we will have an example at the end of this panel, if I'm not wrong. We have a lot, there are out there a lot of administrative data that are good, very fine. We need to find smart ways to match them to the data that we use for monitoring or for measuring the phenomenon of interest, so that we can really help in designing policies. Again, let me give you a positive example with the collaboration we are having with Prospera in Mexico. We are integrating the measured data on child labor with the incredible amount of administrative data they have to answer some very practical questions that they have in the design of the program. Why certain households do not take up all the opportunity that the program offers. A lot of households have the possibility of having 2 children with a scholarship, but they only select 1 child to get the scholarship and pass on the possibility of getting a second, another scholarship. And more, this of course will help to design. Also, what needs to be done to avoid that adolescents enter the labor market. So we are doing experiment with them, but thanks to the use of this large set of administrative data, we can answer some of the questions. The last 2 minutes of the 5, let me go back to impact evaluation or impact of the projects. We need 2 things here that are very important. First, on the impact evaluation in strict sense of the projects, we need a system. We need to have a plan of what are the key elements we want to evaluate in policy terms. Too often, the pattern of impact evaluations or rigorous evaluation we have, they are guided by the fact that data are available, or the experiment, was smart enough, so somebody gave some money. But we should instead be guiding this process, giving incentives to researchers to operate where the policymaker sees there is the less knowledge. The example of Alison, I apologize for calling you by name, but I only see half of your surname. It's very important. If we can use this very prudent approach, then this could be already, for example, a guide to research and say, these are the areas we think where we are really hesitant to act, so we give you $200 million, $300 million for impact evaluation, but you do according to this list. And also, we need to be smart. We don't need only to use impact evaluation, in using experimental data. There are a lot of smart ways to use non-experimental data that can be built when we do data collection or when we do data collection in a repetitive way. I don't want to get into the details here. What I want to stress is that in order to design policies, we need to have strategic impact evaluation. And that impact evaluation can be done in many ways that can link also to the instrument we use for monitoring. Example, and to conclude with the example of the Philippines, in this case, we work together with the government and the World Bank on the pilot they did, and what we found is that the transfer they were giving it was a contingent cash transfer program. So they got a scholarship, but they had to send the kid to school. So the transfer they were giving was enough to convince the household to take the offer, but was not enough to cover the cost of education. So school attendance increased, but also child labor increased in a parallel way, or at least participation of children to economic activity. So a very interesting result that also led then to an adjustment of the project. So this kind of evidence is very relevant, and I think I need to stop. And thank you very much for listening to my grumpy speech.
Thank you, Furio. I think what Furio was demonstrating here is that there are a lot of research needs and competing resources, and I think it's one of those areas where we need to begin where the country is at. Because when we look at the research buckets related to the work we are doing, we are currently with the SDGs focusing quite a bit on monitoring, and monitoring is at the highest levels of the national level. Like, what do those rates of change look like? And I think that, when we look at our buckets, there's data for description and prevalence, then there's data and research for risk factors and protective factors. What can we do to prevent child labor or forced labor or protect? And then there's the data and research for impact. And I think as we worked to get countries measuring just what is child labor and forced labor, we need to recognize that there's a long game in play. And the long game is getting them to implement programs, implement policies, and test whether those policies and programs are working. So last but not least, we have Dr. Luis Fabiano Diaz is here, who is a federal prosecutor, data scientist, and chief research and data officer at the Federal Labor Prosecution Office in Brazil. I thought I had a cool title and cool job. So he's going to share with us a case study from his office and demonstrate how to use data in innovative ways has helped inform policies and programs, especially law enforcement in Brazil.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here to learn from you. I am, we're a prosecution office in the first place, but we also monitor the effectiveness of public policies in Brazil. So, which means that most of the time we try to connect measurements and evidence to law enforcement and policymaking for 5,570 Brazilian municipalities. So it's such a hard job to do that, And in the municipalities, local governments don't know whether what they're doing work a lot of the time, and they don't have the data available, or they don't know which data they should be using. And so the main question we set out to address a couple of years ago was beyond traditional law enforcement mechanisms. How could we nudge policymakers towards better policymaking? How we could nudge them towards better decision making, to scale up our efforts, mostly in relation to vulnerabilities, to exploitation, to prevent these vulnerabilities, right? So trying to push some boundaries, we decided to create a big data platform, a knowledge platform, a knowledge strategy, a better knowledge strategy. And we started to collaborate with government agencies, statistical agencies, institutions, and academia to collect, clean, document, and harmonize data that were not being used for policy making to the extent they should be used. And we're talking about well-known data sources like census with key demographic indicators at the level of municipalities and at the level of census blocks, census rates in much situations. I'm talking about household surveys with information on issues like education, informal works, and child labor. In addition, case management databases from the judiciary, prosecution, inspection, and NGOs we're partnering with. But we're also talking about non-traditional administrative data to raise questions about vulnerable populations that should be targeted. And I'll bring some examples. There is an academic assessment called Prova Brasil given to 6 million public school children that brings a piggyback surveys about whether or not the students work and for how many hours a week. On screen here, top left, we can see these indicators combined with demographics at the level of census blocks. Moreover, we've collected the database of one of the largest, if not the largest, cash transfer program in the world, the Bolsa Familia, that reaches around 12 million families through a basic income conditional on children's attending school and receiving primary health care. So using this database, we're developing the first study on targeting and coverage of such programs towards victims of slavery and child labor and their families, which can also be combined with demographics for a specific location at the top middle of the screen right there. Furthermore, we're also collecting migration databases, with records with foreign workers in Brazil and refugees in partnership with the federal police to develop a mapping of the first mapping of the international migratory routes in partnership with lots of agencies, in addition to the federal police, in fact. And there, top right of the screen, we see a small teaser of the flows. I'm trying to shrink the content to the 7 minutes. But as we can all see. And in addition, we're collecting data on companies' ownerships and tax receipts databases to develop supply chains mapping. So we want to support private stakeholders, in addition to public stakeholders, in relation to compliance, supplier qualification, due diligence, and risk assessment. And we developed a data-driven tool to do so. On screen, middle left, sort of an X-ray of each company. We have data available for 12 million companies in Brazil, active companies, in fact. Using the same data sources, we're using network analysis to perform studies like that one on the middle right of the screen. It's a network of evidence-based relationships to foster the duty of care of the parent and subcontracting companies in relation to their corporate social responsibility. Moreover, on those maps bottom left, we see the result of a study using hundreds of indicators with machine learning algorithms. And we're not talking about machine learning algorithms off the shelf. We're embedding domain knowledge into the algorithms to improve the model we're using, to detect hotspots, vulnerabilities, and resource allocation opportunities. Likewise, on screen, we see images of deep learning experiment applied to satellite images, detecting deforestation hotspots in partnership with the Brazilian Army. Related to the charcoal production, a sector traditionally connected to labor exploitation in Brazil. Besides, labor contracts databases and their time series records are helping us answer questions like, what is the profile of the victim that never gets a formal job? This is a really important question to answer. We're also using public health databases to study the mortality and morbidity of the victims in partnership with the Ministry of Labor because human trafficking, child labor, etc. are public health issues. Right, honey? Well, in brief, we're building all this by breaking the silos of agencies, bringing them all together to have meaningful discussions, using the important political support of the ILO, and with interesting results over the past months without spending much money. This is really important. We're not spending more money than we were before we started this project. It was just analyzing data and putting people to work together, right? So in the first case in which we've used the platform, we have produced unprecedented information concerning hotspots, victims' profile, and mapping of the vulnerable municipalities. And the evidence was used in meetings with the governor of Maranhão, a state in North Brazil, the worst Brazilian hotspot in terms of labor exploitation, who entered into a commitment agreement with our office to develop a new data-driven policy. So to start, focus will be put on municipalities with the worst indicators, and we're going to use the data to develop measures concerning frontline work, information sharing among communities, and targeted services. And this is very important. Most indicators we've used in the case are publicly available for all Brazilian states and municipalities through an online digital observatory on slavery and labor trafficking on screen at the top. And we've developed the tool in partnership with the agencies and the ILO within the SMART initiative. When you access the observatory, you see only what matters. We don't, we didn't put there tons of spreadsheets. We put charts with explanations for each chart to provide the stakeholders with, policy insights. Media outlets have already published thousands of headlines based on the observatory of the past years, and here on screen we see at the bottom a congressman using information from the observatory during a congressional hearing in the early stages of policymaking, which is really important. And this is happening at the state level and at the municipal level. So we're reaching the policymaker with information, with relevant information for them to use. This doesn't mean that we have all the data we need. There's so much work, more work to be done, but making the information flow makes a lot of sense, and that's what we're working on right now, developing, and I'm finishing, new strategies of communication with stakeholders and private and public stakeholders for them to receive information that are relevant for them to make decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists for making sure we didn't go over time like the other panel, or that we followed the example of the other panels. I'm sorry. That we followed the example of the other panels. So we do have a lot of time for question and answers. And I think just to set up the discussions that we're going to have in the next couple of minutes is Mikhail had talked about earlier the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, and there's a group of us here who have been spending the last 2 years with each other learning, arguing, and coming to consensus on methods around forced labor. And I think one of the conversations we would have is questions would be, well, let's talk about the methods. What are the methods to measure forced labor? And I think by the end of it, there are those of us, or many of us, came to understand that before talking about the interventions, we needed to understand what is the problem, what is the research question that we're trying to address. Before we can talk about policies and programs, we need to understand the problem. And I think this panel also showcased some areas that we do need to address. And this is getting data and evidence into policymakers' hands. This is not just, oh, policymakers don't have time. I think Julia's presentation of the survey is actually supported by public policy theory. As a student of public policy, we learned this. Government officials, those who are implementing and designing funding projects, we are busy with a lot of other bureaucratic things. Sorry, as I look at Marcia, sorry, and Allison, that we need help. We need help in understanding the data. How do you translate to get into the hands of government officials? And then that goes into, this is an issue of development. How do we integrate this evidence into policy? And then the third problem that we need to address is how do we get that better evidence, especially for impact, what are the interventions that need to work, and then for forced labor, which methods are still developing, how do we have the best measures, how do we get the data in order to understand the problem, and then of course, so that speaks to how do we improve our own work now, but then also to build the next generation of researchers to carry that work forward. So with that, if we could frame our Q&A with those thoughts in mind, and also with the panel, we'll open it up. And don't all raise your hands at once, because James is not going to let us out until 6 o'clock. Okay, so we have Maurice and then Hani.
Well, I actually want to be a little bit provocative, because so much of the conversation has been about what we don't know and the gaps in evidence and data. But in some sense, that's to say we've spent now 18, 20 years working on this, and we don't know anything. And I don't think that's true. And I want to actually point to Allison's presentation as an example of that, because you called it a conceptual framework. Well, what was implicit to me there was actually a causal model. You were saying, well, we have on the one hand the vulnerable populations, on the other hand we have the target, the perpetrators, we have a permissive environment. We're saying these are the variables that seem to matter under each of those categories. Those are hypotheses to be tested. I don't want to be misunderstood. There are clearly large gaps in that we need to fill. But I want to put this particularly in the context of our engagement with the rest of the development community, because we've said repeatedly during this conversation that we need to mainstream anti-slavery work into the rest of development. Well, you can't have that conversation from a posture of, we don't know anything. You can't have that conversation and say, but we can't propose anything that is a concrete intervention. You can't have that conversation and say that there aren't ways to build upon the knowledge that the development community already has. And let me give you a concrete example. And I want to go back to the presentation on participatory action and research and community mobilization. That kind of work is bread and butter work for development organizations. Mobilizing communities, helping them identify what their vulnerabilities are, helping them build assets so that they can address those vulnerabilities. That's been going on for scores of years, and that knowledge is well entrenched within development organizations. And so I think we need to have much more of a conversation about what have we learned with that actually resonates with the rest of the development community, and build upon that, rather than approach this as a conversation that simply starts from a posture of, well, we just need to do another 20 years of research. But rather, what is it that we know already and that will resonate with the rest of the development community?
Level in terms of risk as well as resilience factors. One of the things that I try to do whenever I share, I have my own social ecological model for trafficking, but one of the things that's important as we're talking to others in the community and making sure that we have evidence to underpin everything that we're talking about is knowing the data behind each and every one of those words, or at least being able to cite something. So it sounds like you're going to be publishing that and making it available publicly, but will you be also sharing the research and the evidence that underpins each and every one of those components so that we can all know that the due diligence has been done? Not to say that we don't trust that, but many of those things are controversial and have political meaning. And so as much as possible that we can make it less about ideology and really about the facts, it'll be helpful to us. So that's just kind of a question and comment there. And then Luis, thank you for the shout out in terms of the public health intersections. I was wondering if you could comment on the potentials that you see from your data, and then what you've learned thus far in terms of the intersections with the public health sector, and maybe that could be lessons learned that inform the rest of us moving forward in terms of measuring progress as well as potential ways of further understanding the problem. And then to Sharita's and Maurice's point around messaging that I'm hearing, what are some lessons that the panelists have learned in terms of that policy translation piece where yes, we all know the facts, and we can speak to the facts and the rationale, but how do we translate that in a way that's compelling and creates change where it matters?
One more question, then we'll bring it to the panel. Aidan, did you?
Yeah. Of what Maurice said, I suppose is more comment than a question, but I've made this point before, I think, in this sort of forum, is that we do have significant learning about what ends slavery. It's called history. I don't think we're paying enough attention to that, and we're certainly not translating that into the sort of robust dialogue with government, business, and others that we should be having in order to try and reduce slavery. We know that education works, particularly whenever it's strongly right-based, particularly when it's focused on girls. We know that unionization and social organization works. We know that discrimination, whenever that is reduced and eradicated, reduces the risk of slavery. We know whenever nations or states are prevented from trading slave-produced or child labor-produced goods, that they are suddenly, magically incentivized in order to reduce slavery practices within their midst. There's one number, I think, which is important, and maybe Michaela will challenge me on this, so she's responsible for that number, which is the 5.5 million child slaves since 2005 in the ILO estimates of forced labor. In 2012, there was 5.5 million children in slavery as well. In 2017, the number had gone up, and it seems to me mostly the number's gone up because of the inclusion of forced child marriage within those statistics as well. So at a time whenever all of the progress on child labour was occurring, we have seen no impact whatsoever on the issue of child slavery, which suggests two things. First of all, people aren't properly recognising child slavery whenever it's in their midst. And secondly, that the whole issue of slavery is not being properly addressed at all. And part of the reason for that is because the lessons of history which we have are not being applied. One of the last things I did as Director of Anti-Slavery was produce the Anti-Slavery Charter, which sets out some of the key lessons of history which will impact upon slavery. It's been endorsed by many of the organisations in this room, many of the individuals in this room. I would encourage all of you to look at it and consider endorsing it also, because that is a platform of common policy which we can campaign on, and I think that's one of the things that is essential.
Thank you, Aidan. So I'm going to pose some of these questions to the panel, and I think for Maurice's questions about what we do know, what I'd like is for Julia to share about how Delta 8.7 is going to share what we do know with others in a little bit more context. And then Furio, if you can share about the research you've done on the risk factors of child labor, the policy mapping, and have used that research to engage governments in other ways than the examples that you have. And then I think if Luis and Allison can speak about some of the, your conceptual framework and your other areas about health that Hani was mentioning, that would be great. So, Julie, would you like to start?
Sure, absolutely. So, Maurice, I totally agree with you. We have a lot out there, and actually in the results of the user survey that I showed quite briefly, very few of the respondents said that research was hard to find, research is not in my language, research is behind a paywall or in gated journals. Some people did make those responses, but it was lower than you might have otherwise thought, including also that research is difficult to understand. Not many said that. People said, I don't have the time to digest it and access it. So this is one of the main goals of the knowledge platform that we're building for Alliance 8.7, which is to take all of what is out there, and we're using openly available data sets, and we're visualizing them so that they're more accessible, easier to understand. And then we're taking those visualizations and providing contextual information as well as information about the methodologies that produced the data sets that are visualized there. It's also, we've been spent a lot of time looking at kind of system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 is sort of here is the response and you can kind of memorize it and understand it, while system 2 is this sort of slow thinking that you need to learn while doing. So in the interactivity of the visualizations that we have on the platform, you have the ability to compare different and turn off and on different indicators. You can look at different time scales. And so in this way, we're hoping that policy actors, especially who come to the site, will engage with the data, not just see it. Also, to that point as well, the forum section of the site, which is our short form content section, we have now 18 columnists who have committed to contribute on a regular basis, which is quite exceptional for something that isn't live to the public yet. And Luis is one, and I showed an article from him on the screen earlier. And so what we're also doing with this is bringing together all of the expertise that is out there in the world, and letting the people speak for their own research, and in short, succinct way. So 800 words, blog post that's putting it all out there. So I think overall, we have some work left to do in order to make this more understandable to people who are not familiar with the field or are not familiar with data and statistics in particular. But we're trying to make strides in doing that with this knowledge platform.
Thank you, Firo. Forio, do you want to speak to some examples of how you've used the research to engage countries in changing policies and programs a little bit more? Especially in the development context.
There are two phases in the, and I talk about child labor. So by now, I agree with Maurice, we know a lot. And so much that if you look at the literature, you hardly find any article on child labor published on the top journal. So this means the effort is to go to the next step, so to go to the nitty-gritty. We need to be able to tell the politician the moment he needs it, and I'll come back to this because this is the most difficult part, what he needs to do. So if you are interested in child labor in agriculture, don't go sector by sector. This doesn't make any sense. Do this or that, or vice versa. So this is what we have been trying to do with the countries, and sometimes more successfully, sometimes less, is to present the situation and say, this is what you are currently doing. If you want to improve on what you are currently doing, do this and that. Now, the challenge of transmitting this information into actual policies is time, because you need to be there when they are making that particular decision. And the information needs to be available at that time. So this is where a lot of issues are still present, in my experience, because as a very small but global project, I mean, we could not be present every time. And also our constituents agencies, they not always have focus on these areas at those times. So also for them who are building, or those, how you say in English, who are building this website, I think the issue is not only of putting the things there, but to find a way, I don't know what can be, to make them available at the right moment when this person has to make a decision. And be a little bit bold also. This is our responsibility.
So before we go to Hani's question for Alison and Luis, I'd also I'd like to make sure that I represent my colleagues appropriately who are back in Washington, D.C. So we have a group of researchers at the U.S. Department of Labor who work on an annual report on the findings of the worst forms of child labor. And this is largely qualitative research. But in this qualitative research of over 1,000 pages, for 130 countries, we have a roadmap based on suggested actions on what governments can do to affect change in relation to policy, programs, coordination, enforcement. By the way, this is also on our Sweat and Toil app. You can look at these suggested actions. But what I want to share with this is that anyone can use this in engaging with governments. In fact, when governments have come to us, they have said, we can't believe that there is an organization that exists dedicated to reviewing all of these laws and what our countries are doing because we don't have the time. So we come to you all and we are actually looking about what we need to do the next thing. And this is also the same case for the JTIPS human trafficking report. And so what we ask of all of you who are engaging with governments, even in your projects, is do please take a look at that and engaging, because we also can't be at, in 130 countries. And we have very concrete examples of where just spending a half day in Serbia has led to concrete actions by them asking how they can get technical assistance to address those findings and working with the ILO through our country-level engagement and action program to reduce child labor. So whether it's this qualitative research or quantitative research, we also need to do the job of dissemination and engagement. So with the next question, I think, Luis, do you want to take the question from Hani? I just want to make sure that I'm representing your question correctly about integrating health into research and policies and projects. Could you just restate that? I'm sorry.
So in terms of the sectors that he interfaces with and aggregates data from, one of them is the public health sector that he called out. And I was wondering if he could speak in more granularity about what that looks like and how he's currently using it to measure impact, to measure change in terms of trafficking, and then where you think that might go in the future if you had indefinite resources.
Wow. I'm not a policymaker, but I'm sort of a watchdog of policymakers as law enforcement. This is really cool. We have this duty of monitoring what's going on with policies, and policies from the health sector and from lots of tech sectors, and there are lots of policies in place that are not working very well. So how should they be improved, right? So we're using data in many ways from, different agencies for deploying it into solutions that might be helpful for policymakers. So in this case, I refer to involving mortality and morbidity of survivors, of victims of trafficking. We pulled databases from 4 agencies together. So they were afraid in the first place of sharing their data. But as we're law enforcement, as we can provide means of safely sharing the data, we've put the agencies to work together to try to figure out things like what were the causes of death of the workers. What were, what's the life expectancy of them? And we had a lot to learn from the public health agencies, because they have analyzed all the data that we have pulled together from 4 different agencies. So they have analyzed the data with a lot of maturity, with a lot of expertise that the different agencies that own the data wouldn't have to analyze the data. So this is one of, it depends much on the problem you want to try to solve. Because if you're trying to have a public health problem regarding survivors, regarding victims, you have to count on the expertise from the agencies who have the expertise, which are the agencies of the public who take care of public health issues. And academics, we are involved with lots of academics and researchers in Brazil and abroad trying to connect, right, to learn from you, to figure out, answers to these questions that transcend the Brazilian reality. So lots of things to learn from public sector, from social assistance agencies, from researchers all around, and we hope, it's our project is at early stages. We have begun like a couple of months ago. I mean, 1 year, right, Thiago? It's like 1 year then since we started to use the data that we have pulled together in our platform. So I hope next year in our next meeting I'll have more answers to give you guys. And well, thank you for the question, challenging one.
Thanks, Luis. Allison, would you like to respond to Hani on your conceptual framework?
Sure, thank you. But before I do that, I might also respond to Maurice, because I kind of want to challenge back the challenge. Because, I completely get the point that you made, that there is a huge body of evidence out there. There are things that we do know. And actually, my presentation wasn't intending to say that we don't know anything. It was almost the opposite. So there were two things that I was trying to get across. One was, and obviously I was talking in broad terms, given the time and the broad topic, but it was about what we can do with the evidence that we do have first. But then secondly, I wasn't trying to say we don't know anything. I was more trying to say that we don't know enough. And I don't think that can be argued with. And it's my view that we don't have the collective body of research that we can use to engage the development community so that they can confidently invest millions or billions of pounds in tackling this issue. When you look at some of the other issues that the development community deals with, like if we're making analogies with health, where it's eradicating polio, you invest in a vaccination and you can be reasonably confident that you're going to have the impact that you're looking for. That's not the kind of space we're in here now, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle it, but I think it's harder to get them to do it, and you do need to have that evidence to show that we're going to be able to have impact. I think there are pockets of community that do it, and there are structures there to do it, and it's just we need to work out better how we can engage with that. And it's something we're trying to do in DFID, in kind of embedding some of our social development advisors, kind of skilling them up on modern slavery and actually getting them to think about how they can integrate into their broader programming. And I think that's the kind of approach we need to be taking. On Hani's question on the conceptual framework, yes, so the conceptual framework, just to be clear, so we developed that in DFID because it's kind of the model we operate in. And if we go out to country offices and say, can you step up your efforts to tackle modern slavery, they kind of turn around to us and say, what is modern slavery? So we had to break it out, and we developed this conceptual framework, which was based on publicly available research and also consultation with experts. But when we publish it, we will obviously put the sources that we've used to develop it. And I would also say, if you do have any comments on it, do send them our way, because we're already happy to receive it. And it's not intended to be, the oracle of all the things that incorporate modern slavery. It's just that what we are using at the moment, and which is also not going to be static. We'll hopefully change it over time as we kind of learn a bit more about the issue and the evidence. And then I wanted to make just one final point on the kind of Hani's other question on public policy and how you translate facts into action. And I think, you're from the health community, I've got a background in the climate community, and I think, the one thing I can say is that evidence is absolutely vital for generating political will. I think, that is the biggest tool that you can have. And I think that came out of Luis's presentation as well. If you can put hard evidence in policymakers' hands, it is probably the biggest generator of change. And so that's what we need to get to in the modern slavery space.
So we can do one more round of questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to James for the closing. Okay, Yuki.
Hi, I just wanted to kind of connect the two panels. So you might have heard some of us say, well, we do research, but we can't share it because often the research, the measurement is not often welcomed by the government that we are working with. So I wanted to see if you have any good examples of where, we have governments that are, or policymakers that are either too busy or deliberately choose to look the other way when we do have evidence. Do you have you seen any good examples of, engaging either civil society, media, or, other actors to try and nudge the government towards paying attention to the evidence?
Bernard, and then James.
you're not supposed to answer a question that someone's just asked, but I will. I think that evidence and government are something much wider than just about modern slavery. They are a general issue. And I was very fortunate to work for 7 years for the UK government as a chief scientific advisor. And we noticed that many other countries just don't like having independent advisors within the government. And the model of the way it works in the UK is that there are genuine independent people like myself who are employed, and somehow we have to make the case, and the climate science is another example, we have to make the case that government works better if they have evidence. You also have to figure out the right way of saying to a government, look, okay, the scientific evidence says this, you don't have to do that. You may have other reasons for doing what you do. You maybe should say why you wish to, you have convictions as to why you do something. So the scientific evidence is only part of it. But somehow this is an example of an area where we have to say to governments, if you want to be good governments, use the evidence. Of course, also don't sacrifice your convictions and your policies and so on, but be informed by evidence. But I have to say that we have to be sure that if we do that, our evidence is not exaggerated. We only say what we really think, because the climate science is another, again, overstatement of evidence at some stages in the process didn't actually help. So when people said, you know, the whole of, I don't wish to name any names, the whole of Manhattan's about to be flooded in a cataclysmic wave, yeah, it made good movie, but it wasn't very good science. So we have to be sure that our science is really good, but then we have to kind of nudge our governments in this way. It's not quite an answer, Yuki, but I think the whole way the British government has worked over, not just in the present case, but several decades actually, demonstrates how it can be.
If I can, I also would like to answer that question. Can I do that, James, from a moderator? But we have a report at the Department of Labor called The List of Goods Made by Child Labor and Forced Labor. It is also on our Sweat and Toil app. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, most governments do not like that we produce that list. There are some and very few governments that have said, we actually like that you list us because it means that the rest of our government can pay attention to this issue. This is an issue of engagement and working with the governments to make sure that they understand we are not producing this list to name and shame them, that we're actually providing this information, first, because it's a congressional mandate. We are asked to do this research, and when we do this research, we do it in the most credible way. And then second, we work with them on how to engage them. And I think that the Malaysia electronic study that Aaron and Verite worked on was a good example of how to build the government's trust throughout and the industry's trust throughout, so that they're not surprised when the results just come to them. It has to be, I don't want to say that the research has to be participatory, but they have to be kept informed in some way, so then it's not like you've already done the research and you said, by the way, here are the results. Yeah. So James, I know that you had a question. And then, Aiden, I see you. I'm just trying to say, and I'll come get you, and then it'll close. So, James.
It wasn't a question. It was a quick reaction to Yuki's question. Is that permitted?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are any number of issues that have been in the global policy domain in the last 10, 20 years that governments have had to grapple with bad news. Think of HIV/AIDS, for example. Or corruption, or even at some level certain human rights abuses. And I think what you're getting at, Yuki, is that we need to think strategically about the evidence, that we need to think about building an evidence base that is going to fit hand in glove with the strategic concept of how we create change at the domestic and policy level when there are issues that governments may prefer to look away from. That's not an easy thing to answer, but again, it goes back to this point that we're probably not the first people to tread down this kind of path, and there are probably lessons we can learn from others about how to do that. And I think, in fact, that was a point you were making earlier around measuring movement building, for example. There are, I'm sure, lessons that you and others could teach all of us about how these things have been done successfully in the past, and what the evidence needed to look like, what formats it needed to be presented in, what kinds of questions needed to be answered. And it might be that actually it's a question of framing. Back to Alison's point, if we frame this as a development opportunity for states, if we can tell them more reliably, if you invest X in this kind of social intervention, you will have these economic benefits at the national level, or even better at the firm level. We can't give firms firm level answers just yet, but I think that's within reach. We're beginning to get towards the kind of evidence that will allow us to have conversations with different organisations, whether it's cities that Nate's working with, or firms, or countries, or even at the global level. This level of investment leads to this return on investment. That's where I think we need to get to, and then this starts becoming not a naming and shaming discussion, but something actually about opportunity and a much more positive narrative.
I have Aiden, Mikhail, and Allison, and then I'm going to turn it over to James. So what I would say is let's be brief because it's 6 minutes to closing. So.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think, let me first of all preface this all by saying evidence is great, rational argument is brilliant. It's great if we had a world that ran purely on evidence and rational argument. Anybody who thinks for a moment that we do needs to look right now at the UK, which is undertaking the most monumental act of self-harm to itself in opposition to all of the evidence and ripping up the peace process in my own country because they're ideologically driven to hate brown people. That's a core thing there, which is facing...
Sorry, could we actually please stick to the discussion in hand?
This is actually a fair point, because here you have...
on both sides of this argument,
right.
I think it's important.
There is, in opposition to the evidence, ideological pursuit of that policy aim. And we see that again and again and again, including within the slavery debate. And it's necessary to put sometimes weight and anger and passion behind the arguments, not just the evidence, because the evidence often doesn't play through. Whenever we look at two key policy examples of this, for example, the Transparency Clause in the Modern Slavery Act and the Fire Safety Accords in Bangladesh, these were both a result not just of rational argument, but actual fact that organising of coalitions to confront government and demand change occurred because the governments were not buying the rational arguments. And when you look at issues which also underpin issues like slavery, such as caste discrimination across South Asia, that's not going to be addressed simply by evidence and rational argument. It needs to be addressed by political pressure as well.
I think, Aiden, we would all agree with you that, I mean, if we could legislate change away or if we could drive change out by the data, but I think you would also agree that if we are going to drive change, it should be based on evidence. So thank you for your comment.
I preface my remarks by saying.
Yeah, okay. So Allison, and then James is going to start the closing.
Thanks. I was just going to briefly come back to James's point, actually, on Yuki's question. I think in terms of nudging governments, I think two of the most important things are really setting out both the costs of not acting and the benefits of acting to societies and economies and businesses as well. I think from what I've seen, that's where you most get traction with policymakers. And now I would add an additional one, I think, of recognising political realities and things that are wider and that we can't change, but really focusing down on things that might have traction and that we can actually use to nudge governments along.
Sure, Erin, will you go to a mic, please?
Just super quickly, I just wanted to say also in the spirit of broadening the kind of community of practice to think also about how to translate measurement and findings to policy, not only at the government level, but the business level and the business community, and starting to try to build a practice of research and rigor around what's working at the level of businesses, in kind of business schools, economics, disciplines, things like that. So.
Thank you, Erin. So 2 things that I'll end with before I turn it over to James. I'm going to put the International Labor Organization on the spot, as they will be working on a global report to look at the costs, the economic costs to society with child labor and forced labor, and what the benefits are in ending that. So they have that in the near future or the later future. And then the other thing that I will just say is, I hope that we can remember that we're not alone in the work that we do. And just a plug that whether it's the Alliance 8.7 platform or the Delta 8.7 platform, that we are able to do some kind of listserv for this community of practice. In the U.S. government, we have an evaluation/research listserv that we can just send out a question that we may not know, just even about how do you calculate sample design, or how have you addressed this problem. And I think that it would be great that we have something like that for our field, so it's not just a one-off when we're meeting at these. So with that, James, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charita, and thanks to that whole panel, which was, I think, very helpful for connecting a number of threads that we've had today. Look, I'm not possibly going to attempt to summarize what we've heard today. It's been an incredibly rich discussion, and it's clearly been a long day in a room without windows and without fresh air, and perhaps that's getting to our System 1 and System 2 as well, Julia. What I do hear from the day, though, I think it's worth just touching on a couple of things that I picked up across the day. The first is, and I think your last point, Charita, goes to this, there's clearly a great appetite for continued learning from each other around these issues. And I do hope that the Delta 8.7 website that UNU is building as a contribution to the Alliance can help with that. It is a platform. We want you to walk all over it, walk all over us, stand on it and speak to each other. The whole point of a platform is that it's a soapbox. You reach an even larger audience, but it depends for its utility and success, therefore, on you using it that way and you seeing it as an opportunity to showcase the work that you're doing to policymakers, yes, but also to each other, and try to continue this effort to build a community of practice, a community of science, if I can put it that way. This connects to the second thing I've heard, which is lots of interest in building what I would call a genuine scientific community. There are certainly pockets of genuine, in fact, very impressive science that have been done around these issues for many years. And I hope no one has received the impression that anybody intended today to suggest that that has not been the case, that this was a terra nullius that was walked into by some saviours. That's not the case at all. But what I do hear is appetite for thinking about how we scale, how we reduce costs, how we come up with standardised or harmonised methods and approaches, tools. And in a sense, I'd put the challenge back to all of you, particularly the researchers in the room. Do not wait for permission to thicken the social bonds of that community. That's what you do. That is the scientific method. Piggyback on the opportunities already available to you, whether it's the American Evaluation Association or other conferences. Start organising panels around these topics. Start organising special issues of journals, symposia. If we can be helpful in some way, I don't know if we can, but if we can at UNU, we'd love to try to be helpful with that. Start moving towards these more open data and collaborative approaches to research. There's nothing, you don't need anybody's permission to do that, of course. Now, I realise that there's always the fundamental question of resources, And obviously, I think what you're picking up is strong signals from a number of actors in the room that if they see genuine movement in this direction, that will help satisfy their needs in order to put financial and economic resources behind that kind of work. The other thing I've heard, though, very clearly is that the science on its own is obviously not going to get us there. We have to think deliberately and smartly about how we connect to policies at multiple levels, whether it's community, municipal, state, national, regional, global, and across a whole range of issue domains. We need, what I heard was a strong suggestion that we need to work even harder to make sure that the policies are being adapted to fit the evidence and not the evidence being fitted to the policies, if I can put it that way. But that means we also have to listen carefully as a research community to the questions that policymakers are asking us to answer, and we have to think about getting the information, as you put it, Furio, into their hands in the right format and at the right time. So websites are not going to solve that. Websites are a valuable resource, but they're never going to satisfy that need for offline engagement. And that suggests we all need to be thinking about more of a push model than a pull model. We can't necessarily wait for policymakers to come and ask us to supply things to them that they don't know they don't know. We have to have a push model that gets it in front of them in the right way and at the right time. Now, there's good news here on two levels. One, the Alliance has already developed a strategy of pathfinder countries, a number of countries that are basically waving their hands saying, we need help, we want your advice. We need to think as a group very deliberately, how do we connect them to you in a meaningful way? How do we make sure that your expertise is available to them to solve problems very soon? Not in 2 or 3 years, but in the next 6 to 9 to 12 months. So that's a challenge in a sense, frankly, to the Alliance. Congratulations on walking in at exactly the right time, Thomas.
What do I have to say?
The other opportunity there is business. You know, business is thirsty for this information, not least because they're coming under increasing compliance and regulatory pressures. Now, there's lots of hurdles to jump there. We've been talking about them all day. But there is a demand there that if we think carefully about how we push out the information and knowledge you've been developing, that is a matchmaking effort that can be done in the short term, I think. But what all of this points to, and it comes back to where we just got to, I think, is we need to be serious that we need strategy. We don't just need more activity, more sound and fury. It needs to signify something, and we need to think about how we develop strategy. We have genuine political momentum around this issue at multiple levels and in multiple places. We have a landing point next July, high-level political forum. One of the goals that will be focused on, Goal 8. There will be a big, bright international spotlight on this issue. It couldn't be a better moment, frankly, for unveiling strategy. And what I would say there is it would be wonderful if that could be tied into vehicles like the Alliance. But again, you do not have to wait for anybody's permission to do this. As a research community, there is nothing to prevent you mobilizing around shared research strategy. You might say resources. There's plenty of resources in the room. You've heard that there's resources potentially available. So I see this as a hugely, I know there's been a battle of light and dark, pessimism versus optimism, people who had a nice breakfast versus those who got a bit hungry at the end of the day. I see this as a hugely optimistic moment. There is a real energy coming together now around how to connect up research to policy and how to do that in a strategic and cost-effective way. I would encourage you all, please, to go away and think about how we can move this forward in the very short term. Let's talk about this in terms of months, not years, months. I come back to where I started the day. What was it, 8,000 some hundred days until we're supposed to have got rid of this problem, period? I would like to not quite succumb to a fatalism that says, well, that's nice as an aspiration, but really there's no chance. I think there's a possibility of having a really good crack at it, or as one of our former prime ministers in Australia used to say, a really good shake of the sauce bottle. So I hope we can take away from today that there's a real opportunity in front of us if we work together and think strategically, and that means beginning to have conversations very soon about what that strategy would look like and how it could be developed, to have another conversation like this, perhaps in the middle of next year, where we don't just have the same conversation again. We're pointing to successes that address some of the challenges we identified today, and where we can begin to suggest that that graph that we had this morning, that nice ski slope piste in good Geneva style, maybe it was blue run, black run, you think? Right. Yeah. Is beginning to come to real life. So thank you all for coming long distances, spending a long day underground to work together on solving this problem. We really appreciate all of your time and energy, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the coming months. Thank you very much. Oh. Yes.
Yeah.